Okay. Let's see here. Hello. Okay, there we go. I apologize. I'm not quite sure what happened. Um, but it decided to cut out once again. So I apologize for that. We are doing it live, so it can be a little bit tricky sometimes, but I apologize for the issues. Trying to get this thing back up and running the proper way here. Now, where was I? Oh yes. So a lot of stuff obviously happening. A lot of stuff happening in Ukraine. A lot of stuff happening globally. Generally speaking, not a very good time. A lot of people are actually very much suffering right now. So with that, the whole point of this program, the whole point of this project is to bring awareness to the stuff that's happening throughout the globe, let you know about what's happening, and to try and raise money to help people, to help the people that are affected by what's happening, these very issues that are ongoing, and to try and raise money, to get that support to them, regardless of whether or not you're talking about the war in Ukraine, you're talking about, natural disasters that have been happening in places like Pakistan, or you're talking about in Southeast Asia, or if you're talking about the famine ongoing there in the Horn of Africa, or you're talking about international conflicts, all sorts of stuff happening, and we want to help everybody that we can. So please check out the video description below and give your support to all the wonderful organizations that are down there. And please be sure to, give them, as much as you can. If you can't give a lot, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. We completely understand. Trust me. I mean, I'm in that position too myself right now. But that right now, when it comes to this kind of stuff, we're never doing any kind of, merchandising for this channel. We're never doing any super chats. We're never doing any of that stuff. So please, if you could, help us to try and spread the word on this project. It's 100% a nonprofit, always will be. We don't profit off of people's misery. That'd be great. If you can't donate, at the very least, try and get the word out. Give us that like, give us that subscribe, all of that fun stuff. As much as I hate to ask for it, it is important. It does help us out tremendously. Now, as we get ready to get into the news here, there's been a ton of stuff happening, as you can see, and please feel free to ask questions. I will answer questions. If you're joining us live, please feel free to ask them in the live chat. I am watching it, and please let me know. I will be more than happy to try and answer your question to the best of my ability. A lot of this stuff is very complicated. A lot of this stuff has to do with conflicts or international terrorism or what have you. Generally speaking, that's what makes the news these days. And I will do my best to try and answer your questions as thoroughly as I can. Now, I'm not an expert in everything, but to give you a little bit of a background on myself, if you haven't watched us before, I served in the Marine Corps between 2016 and 2020 as a corporal and an O-352 anti-tank missileman, which means I was in the infantry. I operated specifically the Javelin anti-tank system, as well as the M41A7 Sabre system, or the TOW missile launcher. As well, on top of that, I was also a fully cross-trained machine gunner, a fully cross-trained rifleman. I was a combat lifesaver Marine, or CLS Marine, meaning I've received additional medical training and was certified to do so. And assist Navy Corpsman. I was partially cross-trained as a radio operator. I've done all sorts of really cool stuff, and I've had a lot of awesome opportunities in the military. I've deployed twice. My two deployments were both to the Middle East. My first deployment I did between October of 2017 to March of 2018, when I rotated to the Middle East and spent 4.5 months in Syria, and then about a month and a half in Kuwait while in transit. My second tour to the Middle East, I was attached and was leading the Javelin anti-tank team attached to the Crisis Response Company in Kuwait. And on New Year's of 2020, I went to the Baghdad Embassy complex, where I oversaw all anti-armor operations during the assault on the U.S. Embassy there. After that, I went to Saudi Arabia, where I trained Saudi Arabian Marines that were getting ready to deploy as part of the Saudi coalition down into Yemen to fight the Houthi rebels. So I am, I'm a subject matter expert in anti-armor warfare and armored doctrine. Like I've said before, I'm a fully cross-trained rifleman, fully cross-trained machine gunner, CLS Marine, and a partially cross-trained radio operator. Being as such, I was also a small unit team leader. So I was in charge of a Javelin anti-tank team, like I said, on my second deployment. So I'm well-versed in small unit leadership and small unit tactics, and can speak extensively to that. Outside of that spectrum, I do try to remain very well-rounded. I'm very interested in history, geopolitics, and that sort of thing, but I am no expert. But I will do my best to explain certain situations ongoing throughout the world to the best of my ability. And if I don't know the answer to your question, I will simply say as such, because you can't be an expert in anything. It would take many, many lifetimes. But with anything, expert or not, I always implore you as the viewer to please do your own research. There is no substitute for doing your own research. In fact, if you want a starting place, however, feel free to, our website is also listed in the description below. Go on to there, go to our works daily maps, and you can click on 2022, and we have uploaded each and every one of our maps that we have been archiving, which starts in about April. Since we started archiving our actual maps, we have them all uploaded by date on there from each stream. And you guys can actually go through, and if you want to follow along during the streams themselves, please feel free. If you want to go back through and do some research or click on some associated links that we have listed but didn't show on the stream, you can do that as well, and you can start in your research you would like from there to kind of get your idea onto the situation. So we've archived it all, and it should all be there for you. But with that, we go ahead and we get ready to dive right here into the news. Of course, we start off with our special report, which is coming out of course, the country of Ukraine, which has been embattled for over 9 months in a horrendous war that has been fought against it by Russia, which invaded the country on February 24th of 2022. So that's kind of what we're looking here. We actually start off over here for once in the Zhytomyr Oblast, which is not something that I normally talk about very often. But we see over here where Bear Grylls, who you may remember from several different Discovery Channel shows, the great survivalist, I believe he was a Royal Marine or with the SAS, I can't remember which. He's done a lot of survival shows, but he's actually appeared here in Ukraine, here in the Zhytomyr Oblast, and with recent sub-zero temperatures and frequent power outages, locals can teach him a thing or two on survival. But we do have some photos of him actually being here in Ukraine, in the Zhytomyr Oblast, here walking around and talking. Apparently he's brought his camera crew too. Not quite sure what he is doing there, but we do know that he is there in general. So kind of an interesting tidbit there. But now that we get into some of the more serious and hard-hitting news here, coming out of Kyiv, of course, which is the capital of the country of Ukraine. And we start off with the fact that French M270s ended up arriving in Ukraine. French-donated M270 rocket systems arrived in Ukraine. These perform exactly as the German variants of the M270 do, or the Mars 2 systems. And they also perform exactly like the US-made HIMARS system, which is on wheels instead of on tracks, essentially. It has also a little bit less of an ammunition capacity. This will further extend kind of the flexibility of the Ukrainian ability to provide long-range precision fires, which is what the purpose of the HIMARS is. The HIMARS is so accurate, the HIMARS missiles are so accurate, they will put a telephone-sized missile between me and the camera that I am speaking to you from. It is that accurate. It's accurate within 1 meter, which makes it as accurate within a 10-digit grid, essentially, meaning it will hit its intended target. As long as everything is working properly with the missile and the system itself and the data input. So we do know that it is extremely accurate. The HIMARS and the M270 Mars 2s, which were provided by Germany, are filling that exact same role. So far, 4 have been donated by the French, which have arrived in country, as we can see it confirmed by Alexei Reznikov. He is the Secretary or the Minister of Defense for Ukraine. And so he actually ended up confirming that for us, that they did end up receiving these things. That is the M270 system. It's older than the HIMARS is, but it does the exact same job, and it was the precursor to the HIMARS. The HIMARS is meant to be highly mobile, as a platform. These things are a little bit slower. They're on tracks, but they carry a very hefty punch. And we've seen these things used to great effect. 4 guns, generally speaking, 4 MLRS systems, whether you're talking the HIMARS or the BM-21 Grad system, or 4 tubes for mortars or artillery guns, towed artillery pieces, or 4 self-propelled guns. Generally speaking, that is the number, that is the magic number to create a battery for these. So that's kind of what we see here. And so they're saying that they received 4 of these things, the 4th brother of the Longhand family. So what we see with these is they have essentially been given a battery of these things, which allows them, now they have another complete unit that they can move across the battlefield and engage enemy forces as need be. And it makes them more flexible, more able to maneuver their forces and to continue to put pressure on Russian forces where needed with these systems. Delta Aviation 23 asks, Zelensky said countermeasures are being prepared to attack the Russians. What could it mean? It could mean a lot of things. So an interesting thing when it comes to this war is a lot of people have maps. You talking about whether you're watching the UA Live map, you're taking a look at our maps, which are fairly accurate but not entirely. Or you're talking about any other streamers you may be watching, or video, or content creators you may be watching, or whether you're talking about Institute for Study of War, anything that is much more, I would say, in depth in certain subject areas of this of the conflict that are maintaining these maps. The thing is that none of these maps are static, and unfortunately there is no better representation than a relatively static line to kind of show you as things evolve over time. But what we see here, our accuracy on this map is depending generally on the area. It depends entirely on the information coming out that becomes available to us. But we have had instances, a couple instances actually last stream, that we were very proud of, that we were accurate in about within 2 miles of the actual events that were happening, that we were reporting on. We were accurate on where the front lines were within about 2 miles. And those were the ones that we could geolocate and confirm exactly where they were on the battlefield. So what you have to understand is that a war is like fluid in a glass. If you take a water glass and you mix it around, it sloshes, it moves back and forth, and then at the end of once everything is finished and done with, it ends up settling finally and goes back to being a calm, flat surface. But right now, what you're looking at with this war, and any map you're looking at, is the fact that this is a war of attrition. And you're seeing that, what you're also seeing is that these battle lines, these front lines, are constantly shifting. There are small scale attacks and counterattacks, whether they be team size, squad size, platoon, company, battalion, regiment, brigade size. No matter what you're talking about, these are different scales of attacks, but this battle line is constantly shifting, and it is entirely impossible. There is no one person, there is no one organization that has the full picture, and that means that it's impossible to have complete accuracy on this in any way, shape, or form. But it is constantly evolving. It's constantly changing. This is why the term is that the situation is fluid and kinetic, meaning it has a lot of energy to it. So there's constantly being counterattacks. What they're probably talking about for you to actually get to your question there, Delta, is the fact that they're probably preparing an actual counteroffensive, like an actual major offensive operation in a certain area. I'm going to go ahead and bet on the Luhansk Oblast. And the reason being is that there's a lot of pressure down there in Donetsk, but Donetsk is relatively holding right now. And we were already suspecting this because the Ukrainians don't really have to push across the Dnipro River. So all of those forces, those tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops that were caught here in Kherson fighting the Kherson offensive, now they're no longer needed there. You can use very minimal troops, hold the line across the Dnipro River. Very good geographic boundary between the two warring powers, And then you can shift those tens of thousands of troops over here into the Donbass, where they're much, much, much more needed to be used and can be better utilized to succeeding in different aspects of the war and being put in places where they may be having difficulty. And we'll get to some of those here once we actually get into the meat and potatoes of the war and once we get into the Donbass. So, but that's probably what he's talking about. They are it would be reconcentration of forces to prepare for a counteroffensive. That is probably what he is in reference to. But once again, I am not talking to President Zelensky. I am not part of that inner circle whatsoever. I'm not part of even the outer circles of that. I am getting what we can find in very open sources that we can find that is credible regarding that. And so it could be a number of things, but that is probably the main possibility that we're looking at, considering the situation on the ground and what Ukraine has stated that their goals, their intentions are moving through this war and how they plan on going about them, was they very publicly stated and have maintained to this point. As we continue down here, over in Kyiv, we get a child casualty update. And this child casualty update comes from the Prosecutor General's office. Because since the beginning of Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine, 440 Ukrainian children have died, 852 children have been injured. Most victims among children are from the Donetsk region. Moreover, 329 Ukrainian children were reported missing, and 12,034 were deported. Once again, coming from the Prosecutor General's Office of Ukraine. Now, forced deportation of children is actually a crime of genocide. To transfer children of a group to another group perpetrated on national lines, as we have seen here, is actually a crime of genocide under the 1993 Rome Statute and the 1949 Geneva Conventions. So that is one of the main arguments right now for the crime of genocide, aside from the complete disregard for about every international law ever written by the Russian forces and the explicit targeting of civilians and civilian populations and deprivation of civilians' right to life, essentially. And I don't just mean outright killing them. Under the 1949 Geneva Conventions, to bring about circumstances for the cause of their destruction is actually one of the terms for identifying a crime of genocide, meaning you create a situation in which somebody can no longer survive, even if they have up until that point and weren't outright killed. You could argue Mariupol is in this fashion, as the city is completely destroyed. There's no infrastructure, there's been no medicine, no real humanitarian aid, and it's really been outright just natural selection and survival at this point, with the Russians probably aiding in that, as we've seen. Severodonetsk, a lot of footage has been coming out lately of Severodonetsk. Also, same situation as Mariupol, essentially completely destroyed. Bakhmut, same situation. And you could say that by targeting the civilian infrastructure, which is a war crime in and of itself, based off of the Additional Protocol 1 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions adopted in 1977, which explicitly defines the difference between a military and a civilian target regarding infrastructure. Then by knocking out the power and therefore the gas and water supplies to most of Ukraine right before the harsh winter hits, the very well-known freezing winter that literally stopped two invasions in Russia, being Napoleon's invasion in the early 1800s, and then also the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa in 1941, where oil and fuel literally froze inside of the vehicles. It was so cold. That is the type of weather Ukraine was expecting to have. That is a Ukrainian winter. That is a Russian winter, and that is what troops are facing on the front lines, but also now what civilians are going to be facing without this power and without this electricity, without that gas, without that running water. That means that it is bringing about a situation to cause the physical destruction of a people based off of national lines. We see that the refugee crisis continues as a result of the war. This is one of the largest influx of refugees fleeing conflict since World War II in Europe, and we see, quote, as of November 22nd, the number of Ukrainian citizens registered as refugees in European countries reached more than 4.75 million people. Among European countries, Poland has the largest number of refugees from Ukraine. And that comes from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR. So that is the situation with refugees. Poland has taken in a lot of refugees. They've been very, very welcoming with very much open arms to these people that are fleeing this war zone, and have been provided a large extent of services and places to go. Really, the entirety of the country of Poland has opened up the doors to pretty much anyone that needs it at this point, and it's been pretty fantastic. And we do have actually a team member from Poland who did a lot of work with that. So it's pretty awesome to hear firsthand some of the work that they've been doing as well. So we continue on here. 12 Ukrainians were released from captivity. 12 more Ukrainians were released from captivity from Russian captivity during another prisoner exchange on November the 26th. We actually get a short video of this from the security services of Ukraine. Take a look. And so we can see these guys walking back here. Yeah, I see someone's going to bed because of their tinnitus. Yeah, I hope you get some good sleep, man. Yeah, tinnitus sucks, by the way. I have it in both of my ears. Yes, wear hearing protection when shooting. It's immensely important. I didn't realize that until later in life. But yes, I understand the pain, my friend. I do understand the pain. So, yeah, but the white noise thing that one of our mods, Riley, put into the chat, that white noise thing, it does help. But also recommend taking a shower. That I've always noticed a warm shower helps too. Moving on, we see more equipment coming from Slovakia. Slovakia has donated, for being such a small country and having a very low defense budget and relatively small military, Slovakia has donated quite a significant portion of their equipment to Ukraine. They've been a huge supporter of Ukraine so far, and that is proportional. And that, when you're talking about proportion of what they have, that's really what we are seeing here. But so far, Slovakia has now provided an additional 30 BMP-1s, which the point of a BMP-1, the BMP-1 is the oldest version of the BMP. It's an infantry fighting vehicle, has armor between 12 and 25 millimeters thick. Not exceptionally great as a vehicle in the modern age, but an infantry fighting vehicle nonetheless. It's an armored vehicle, provides basic protection against small arms fire, anything really below a 50 cal, or a Dishka round, or an SVT, which is what we would see from the Russians. So it's generally pretty good. BMP-1s, they have basically a small cannon. The Delta Aviation says these BMP-1s were traded for 15 Leo 2A. Not our understanding. And coming from the Ukrainian government themselves, specifically the General Staff of the Ukrainian Army, they said that pleased to confirm that the 30 Slovak BMP-1s have been transferred to Ukraine under a round exchange agreement with Germany. The Minister of Defense of Slovakia Yaroslav Nagy announced the transfer of 30 BMP-1s to Ukraine. So this is coming from the General Staff of Ukraine themselves on their official Twitter. So that is our understanding, is that they received the 30 BMP-1s. They did not receive 15 Leo 2As. Unless you're saying that they received 15 Leos, which is possible. We have seen that happen before, where certain countries will pick up slack in certain areas, especially within that region. We see where different countries have given up their where they have given up their equipment for. They have given up their equipment for things like what have you, for like aircraft, like when they give aircraft to Ukraine or they give spare parts to Ukraine that they need to maintain their own aircraft. We will see that the other countries around them will provide fighter coverage for their nation under mutual defense pacts or what have you, in order to make sure that they are always protected in the skies. And we're seeing that kind of working around its way to make sure everyone is still protected when they are giving up something that is vulnerable, that makes themselves more vulnerable to a possible further aggression, especially on the fact of Russia. But we get to a very important point here, and this is one that I think is very much worth talking about in a much more in-depth fashion, because it's something that a lot of people have probably heard at this point. If you follow Ukraine and you follow the war in Ukraine and you've been following the events and you've learned some, it's important to talk about other things that have happened. And one of the huge things that has been brought up and that Ukraine is actually remembering is that on the 26th, it was Holodomor Remembrance Day. Holodomor comes from Mortier Holodor, which is meaning death by starvation. And it's from on November 26th, Ukraine very solemnly remembers the Holodomor, which occurred. It occurred between 1932 and 1933, and the Holodomor was a man-made famine created by the Soviet Union that killed between 7 to 10 million Ukrainians. It killed, once again, between 7 to 10 million Ukrainians between 1932 and 1933. On top of that, information about the Holodomor has been brutally suppressed by the Russians and the Soviet Union, of course, but also later, as we will get to, the Russians as well. And they further suppressed, during this time period, Ukrainians in general. They suppress them by destroying literary and cultural works, whether you're talking about art, you're talking about books, you're talking about literature, you're talking about teaching materials. All of this was destroyed. Or a large quantity was destroyed by the Soviet Union, actively pursuing it. They also had numerous bans throughout the Soviet Union's history where they banned speaking Ukrainian, and to enforce also speaking Russian. These numerous bans were imposed, and this is something that Ukraine has harped on for a while, and why the I in Ukrainian, the Ukrainian I, it's specific to Ukraine itself in their language, as opposed to the Russians, as opposed to Russian, which is very similar. They have really held on. That's very much a symbol of being Ukrainian, that they have latched onto because of those bans. Ukraine, along with 22, now 23 other nations, have officially recognized the Holodomor as a genocide committed against the Ukrainian people based on the basis of nationality. The European Parliament has recognized the Holodomor as a crime against humanity perpetrated by the Soviet Union, and the Russian government still denies that the Holodomor ever occurred, and even as of this year, during the occupation of certain areas such as the city of Mariupol, monuments to the victims of the Holodomor were destroyed, and Russia stated that they were state-level disinformation. which is their reasoning for destruction of it. They do not acknowledge that the Holodomor even occurred. So that is the Holodomor in a short, brief history. I highly recommend that you read more into it. There's certain things that are highly contested about it, that that definitely has a lot of political issues attached to it in the recognition of it. But we'll get to a little bit more into that when we get into the international news, as we do have some more follow-on information regarding this. But yeah, once again, it was a genocide against the Ukrainian people. This isn't the first genocide against the Ukrainians, against the Ukrainian people that the Russians have really perpetrated, and we continue to see that here. This is, of course, coming from the Holodomor Museum in their official Twitter, and they have released, of course, this picture. It was retweeted by about every government agency in Ukraine, but they have provided a lot of works regarding this. And that allows us to get over here and start working our way towards the Donbass. We move over here. This is in Belyapelia, which is over here in the Sumy Oblast. And a 15-year-old child was actually killed in the shelling here. Quote, Russian occupiers shelled the city of Belyapelia in the Sumy region on November 30th. A 15-year-old boy was killed. A building of a local hospital was partially destroyed. Rescuers are currently sifting through the rubble. And that is coming from Dmytro Zavetsky, the head of the Sumy Regional Military Administration. JP has a question. There was an argon-filled sighting system used on the original Stingers. You had like 45 seconds to acquire a target, or you had to plug a new one in. Do I have that right? I never actually used the Stinger system. I have seen the Stinger system. The schoolhouse for I think they're called LAD gunners, light anti-air defense. That's all who uses the Stingers in the Marine Corps. Their school is out in 29 Palms, which is where I was stationed. But I have never personally used one. Now, my understanding is that it does use argon gas. It would be it's called a BCU, or a battery cooling unit. And the purpose of it is to basically cool the missile and the system itself down. Missiles, believe it or not, have to be cooled. And a lot of things has to do with temperature. That's just based off of how missiles work, without getting too in depth as to how modern missiles that the U.S. military actually uses works, because a lot of that is classified. But there's different types of cooling. The most common one is called argon gas. It's the exact same. My understanding is that the one that is used by the Stinger is very similar to the argon gas BCU used by the Javelin missile, which you do occasionally get certain ones for. I don't think I can disclose how long the BCU lasts, because I believe that I do believe that is probably classified. I've never seen it listed anywhere that is unclassified. But yes, there is a time limit. It lasts only for X amount of time. It is not extremely long, but it is longer than you would think. Yes, Rooster Fontaine says, I thought the cooling system had something to do with heat-seeking components. Generally speaking, yes. Once again, I don't want to I haven't read. A lot of the stuff I have is for official use only, or is stuff that I have learned through my job that you would be considered classified, I'm sure. Because you have to hold an NSC, or National Security Clearance, for certain things that you do. Not to get into levels and whatnot, but so I don't want to disclose something unless I'm 100% sure it's something that's available publicly, if that makes sense. Just for safety's concerned, and also I would really, really like. I would not last a day in prison. So, yes, it does have to deal with the heat-seeking components, but I will not go into detail. Further on from that, we move over here and we actually start getting into the Donbass, and we actually come over here. This is, in general, this isn't an exact location for this one, but this is coming from the Luhansk Oblast, coming from Sergei Haida, who is the head of the Luhansk Regional Military Administration. And he has stated that Ukrainian forces are making slow progress, but they're continuing their offensive towards Zvotove, and Crimea. And they're doing so successfully. So he actually posted this on his official Twitter. And he said, AFU, or Armed Forces of Ukraine, advancing little by little towards Zvotove, and Crimea battles continue constantly. The situation is quite difficult. So the situation is quite difficult. If you take a look at this picture, you can see these artillery guns. This is an M777, 155 millimeter howitzer. It is digging itself into the nice soft mud that is here in Ukraine. You can see there are stabilizers that are coming off the back of this thing. You can see they've completely dug themselves into the mud. Mortars, their base plates are sinking into the horrendous mud of this battlefield. Is constantly making it difficult to adjust fires. Something very similar if you ever read about the Battle of Okinawa. If you read, it would be with the Old Breed on Okinawa and Peleliu by Eugene Sledge. Then he describes the difficulty of the mud on Okinawa he was a mortarman, and he he explains how difficult it was to operate mortars and artillery in the mud of Okinawa. Very similar in that kind of understanding to what's happening here. But you can do it. You can be successful. But the overall tactical situation on the ground between the Russian and Ukrainian forces in their concentrations, as well as the environmental conditions on the ground, have made it extremely difficult for both sides to maneuver effectively and to effectively gain an upper hand advantage against one or the other. Both are, in a lot of ways, in static defensive positions, fighting an artillery duel that is a horrendous battle of attrition. And it is now freezing cold. It is wet. It has been raining and snowing constantly. And the mud is literally, it's Rasputitsa, which literally translates to sea of mud. So the situation is incredibly difficult. And we'll get to a little bit more of that too. But as we come down here into Liman, one person was dead and 3 were injured during Russian shelling. Quote, on November 29th, Russian aggressors fired missiles at the residential sector of Liman in the Donetsk region. 1 person was killed, 3 citizens were injured and received medical care. That's coming from Kryilo Tomashenko, the deputy head of the president's office. Once again, I apologize for my horrendous pronunciation. But I've never been good at pronunciation to begin with, so just take it as it comes, guys. I apologize. I mean no offense to anybody. I just can't speak. I barely speak English. As we jump down here into Kramatorsk, which is the de facto head of government for the Ukrainian-controlled regions of the Donetsk region, we get an update from, of course, Pavel Korolenko, who is the head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration. He says, quote, on November 28th, a number of victims of the Russian army in Donetsk Oblast increased by 5 killed, 15 injured. Since the 29th, or since yesterday, we haven't seen an update coming from him, but this is the latest one. And so far, not including areas under occupation, such as Mariupol, Volnovakha, Donetsk, or a multitude of other areas in the Donetsk region, so far 1,235 Ukrainian civilians have been killed and 2,662 have been injured since the beginning of the war on February the 24th of this year. This does not include casualties sustained throughout the 8 previous years of fighting. It's HIMARS o'clock over here towards the front lines, and we see a couple of HIMARS doing what they do best. Take a look.
Красавцы!
that, for whoever's on the receiving end of that, that is what you would call a really, really bad day. But this is an absolutely terrible last few days and an absolutely horrendous last few weeks. We've talked multiple times on this channel about just how brutal the fighting around Bakhmut has been. It has been horrendous. It has been absolutely horrendous. It is almost indescribable. It is indescribable. Justifiably indescribable as to how bad the fighting is around Bakhmut. This is some of the most brutal, bitter fighting that has been seen the entire war. It is a complete and total World War. It is World War I in the 21st century around Bakhmut. It has been in fighting for months continually. This region has seen fighting for months. It has turned into a mud and water-filled cesspool. Every building in Bakhmut is either damaged or destroyed. The trenches are filled to their knees with mud and water. Every tree has been splintered like a toothpick. The forests are gone. They have been vaporized and turned into shrapnel. The artillery fire is continuous, either outgoing or incoming. Usually both. And the Russians are attacking Ukrainian lines in waves. I truly do mean waves. The same charges that you see across the battlefields of the Somme and Verdun and in Passchendaele Ridge. Those same charges between two different static trench lines across no man's land are the exact same things that you are seeing that the Russians are doing as they throw themselves to the Ukrainian line in massive numbers and are cut down by machine gun fire. But we have gotten quite an extensive amount of information coming out of Bakhmut. Bakhmut, it would seem that the Russians have reconcentrated a large force in the area around Bakhmut. And generally speaking, in this sector of the front period, ranging all the way from about the north of Soledar, ranging all the way south, almost towards Horlivka. And we're seeing quite in this general area, in the span of about, well, let's see here, in about 20 miles-ish. In about 20 miles, this 20 miles is nothing but utter destruction and death on a scale that is unfathomable to the human mind. That is what we're seeing here. This 20 miles is the most brutal area of the entire front line. Hands down. Here's some of the footage just coming out of Bakhmut. We've seen that the Russians have dedicated an exceptional amount of troops in this area. And they have dedicated additional forces around Bakhmut. And they have been pressing the attack here quite heavily over the last about 5 days. It's been very, very bad. The Ukrainians are having a very difficult time as this is kind of a renewed resolve against them. The Wagner group has brought in a lot more troops once again, and it's just turned. It's been a very difficult situation. We've heard a lot of back and forth, and we'll get to that here in a few when we get a little bit further south. But this is some of the footage coming out of Bakhmut. So these are guys that are in their trench line here. You can see the sign of Bakhmut as they're digging in.
Ой, пацани будуть питати, де цей, як його, де позиція, скажу, ось дивись.
твою мать, тут тобі позиції.
We see these guys, they're rocking. That appears to be a 60 millimeter mortar. One of the reasons you can tell it's a 60 millimeter mortar is, one, it's relatively small, has a relatively small base plate, and it also has a trigger. So you can actually fire these things with a trigger. That's one of the cool things about the 60 millimeter mortar. So, but these guys are apparently a 60 millimeter mortar team. And you got their aiming stakes and everything just thrown into the back of this pickup here. Probably getting ready to go do a scoot and shoot. And you can see the mud and the water that has built up over this area. And it is sub-zero temperatures already. It is sub-zero temperatures across Ukraine. Oh, I think there were 2 videos in that. I apologize. We'll go back and... Yep.
Yes.
Yep, 60 millimeter mortar team. Definitely. This is an American-made, I think, 60 millimeter mortar too. We had 81 millimeter mortars, so I'm not quite sure the nomenclature of these ones, but we had 80 millimeter mortars, or 81s in my weapons company. So I was never really around these guys unless I was with the lines, with the line platoons or the rifle platoons. I mean, they're effective. They work. There's also some really cool stories of 60 millimeter mortarmen doing some really cool things in like Fallujah. So, but they are incredibly handy. But yeah, they definitely have a. But definitely the man portable of the 2. Let's see, what do we got here?
Сбитая фраза. Ну вот он, блядь. Русский мир. Город Герой Бахмут. Тут місцеві ще живуть, мабуть. Правильно.
So you can see the general situation there in Bakhmut is just not very good if you happen to be one of the hundreds of people still living there. See, coming from the Ukrainian forces here.
Джон, это лазурный или не видно? Але Джон, я хочу очей нема, пильні піде. Джон, я хочу.
Once again, more of that destruction coming from some footage of Ukrainian troops there in Bakhmut. once again, the entire city is just damaged or destroyed. There's just not really anything left. Here we got some of the footage coming from the trenches.
Ты шо, охуел там, блядь? На, сука, пидорас! Ебать черти, сука, как они заебали.
Дай автомат, ладно. Передохнули. Хватайте, ребята, быстрее.
Это самое передохнули.
Давай назад, по бордюре назад. За бариком бегом.
Давай, хватай.
Yeah. Life never sucks more than while under artillery barrage. That brings back some not so fantastic memories. So for those that don't know, after the Iraqi protesters left the embassy, they were there for about 48 hours, burned down a bunch of buildings, breached the wire, all that fun stuff. After the Iraqis left the embassy, the Kataib Hezbollah started shelling us pretty much all night for about a month and a half. And they bracketed us in to where they were landing rounds onto our buildings, which were rated to take rockets, luckily. So only one person, I think, the entire time I was there was ever wounded by some shrapnel, and that's because of a very close proximity attack to us. We could actually see them when they fired at us. So I can attest, being under shell fire, horrendous experience. Absolutely horrendous experience. there's a reason why post-traumatic stress used to be called shell shock. And this is every single day, 24 hours a day. You saw these guys kept moving and they just kept coming under fire constantly as they're trying to get their wounded out. I mean, it is just incredibly horrendous. It is unfathomable. Just blows your mind. You see some guys that are on their way up to these guys have probably been rotated out and they're probably heading back up to the trenches here. But yeah, being under shell fire is just, it's a whole different type of hell. You can see the hail coming in here. These are coming from the trenches. Okay, you can see this guy. You can see the thick mud in the trench. I mean, he's just soaked. He is covered in dirt and mud and grime. The man is trying to eat something out of a can. You could make this picture black and white, and you almost couldn't tell, except for his vest, that it wasn't World War One. It's his World War One in color is what we are getting to see from this region. And you can see here, the trees are just splintered. The mud is just covered in his boots. You can see just how thick this, or how deep the water is in the mud in these trenches. This is what causes a significant and has caused significant casualties over time. This situation here is why for a long time, if you ever look at old photos from World War One and very early on in World War Two, troops, Allied troops especially, have these very high, they wrap up their boots and up their legs and up their pant legs. That is specifically because of this. It gives you more support in your legs, but it is that those foot wrappings, those boot wrappings were because of trench conditions like this, which were causing people to get things like trench foot and frostbite, which caused a significant amount of casualties during the First World War, and were probably one of the biggest issues for all sides during that war. German trenches, generally speaking, were built to be permanent. If you look at how their construction was made, they were built to be permanent. The Germans got as far as they could and said, push us out. And the Allies, during World War I, built very temporary, idealistically, they built rather temporary trenches by comparison, and the conditions were much, much worse in them as a result, because they weren't expecting for things to last that long. They were expecting to be on the offensive and on the move in short order. But that is the similar conditions we see here. And there's a reason why you build trenches in certain ways. And you can see this guy is just covered clear up into his knees in mud, and he is just caked. It is an absolutely terrible situation, and this shell fire is making it worse, because now the entire ground around them is kicked up. It is nothing but soft, churned up earth that is now mud and filled with, and shell craters filled with water. People literally, after enough time, people will literally sink and drown in the mud. We've seen it happen once again during the First World War. That is why there are so many people that are missing from World War One. They are listed as missing because they literally sank into the mud and their bodies were never recovered, and they're now buried deep under French fields. They find entire dugouts filled with guys, filled with the remains of troops from World War One in just massive fields, because a tractor happened to fall through the now rotted timber. Like that's a thing. And we're seeing those kind of conditions and the same kind of tactics, that heavy usage, that heavy reliance on artillery here in Ukraine. Pavliklenko taking some photos of some of the damage here from the most recent shelling. Happened early this morning here in Bakhmut. Ottenbrook says, who'd imagine all those World War One reports and books I've read would be current news in 2022? It is crazy. It is crazy how this war is being fought, and what kind of situations it has produced. It's not what you would expect to see out of a modern 21st century war. It really isn't. But that is what we do see. That is what we see, that technology. The reason World War One develops into the trench warfare it does is because warfare had advanced so much in the last 20, 30 years since the last time a major war had been fought between powers in Europe. And it went from guys in colorful uniforms marching in lines against each other, really Napoleonic tactics or diversified Napoleonic tactics from later in the 18th century, to, now we're looking at, or the 18th and 19th century, now we're looking at machine guns. And you see very early on in the beginning of the war that they anticipate it to be very much maneuver warfare in these big open plains, big open fields of Europe, and cavalry charges are still a thing. There's still cavalry units. There are, you see that the French, they're wearing these very colorful blue and red uniforms, and they are doing massive wave charges at these troops that are dug in, that they start to dig in because they know, the Germans know how bad the machine gun is and how effective it can be. And it just mows down the cavalry. It mows down the incoming infantry like it was nothing. One gun is doing the work of entire platoons and companies. And wars advance so rapidly, but the tactics haven't. And so both sides, the safest place to go is underground. You see these huge amounts of trenches being built. And what we're seeing here is that exact same mentality of the war is extremely deadly now. We've gotten very good at killing each other since the last major war in Europe 80 years ago. And now we are, now the safest place to go is in the trenches, is underground. And now we're trying to figure out how tactics can catch up. And we're seeing some of that developing. We're seeing like the HIMARS allows for precision fires, reduces artillery capability, which therefore allows for the maneuver of troops, which therefore pushes, and cuts off Russian supplies, which means that it's harder for them to repel an assault. And we're seeing where wide encirclements aren't quite working, so you're really just trying to pressure forces in multiple angles as opposed to trying to pressure them in one. It's insane. It really is just insane. But that is the reality. Is the same scenario, while the technology is different that is causing it, the same issues that you see happening in World War One, you see developing here, where technology is advanced but the tactics haven't, and as a result it has made war so deadly that both sides dig in, and really it's very slow to maneuver. But you see some breaking points in other locations. I mean, things have changed. It's just in some areas that is just how bad it is. Question I saw earlier coming from Bookham 40. Bookham stated, if I can get it up here, with talk of Russian bombers about to launch an attack, does the Ukrainian Air Force have the capability to intercept them in Russia by using drop tanks? They have the ability to intercept them. They have the ability to intercept them in Russia. They do have drop tanks for their aircraft. We've seen them operate with drop tanks. So there's videos of them operating with drop tanks. So they definitely have that capability. The issue is that it would be dumb to try and intercept them in Russia. Russia's entire tactic for their air force is the fact that they operate their air forces in close proximity to their air defense systems, because they have an extensive air defense system network. And so they can lure in fighters, or they can lure in aircraft into their air defense coverage, and instead of the aircraft having to do an engagement, an air-to-air engagement, the SAM systems would assist in the engagement and would ultimately be what was responsible for shooting down that aircraft more than likely. That was the tactics that they developed. Their air defense network is developed to fight against NATO aircraft, which they know have a superiority advantage over per unit over their aircraft technologically. But that's why they enveloped them into basically using them as an additional air defense network instead of really providing a defensive role in a majority of the time. So it would be in Ukraine's best interest to intercept them over Ukraine when those bombers lack that air defense coverage, making it significantly easier to intercept them, one, and two, making it significantly safer for their aircraft to intercept them, because the only thing that they now have to worry about is a fire escort, which at that point they're on even terms. And we've seen that Ukrainian pilots, generally speaking, are much more capable than Russian pilots. And most of the Russian pilots that were experienced, a lot of them have been shot down now. So you're looking at newer pilots with less flight time, less experience. This is why you see them crashing during training flights in Russia and slamming into apartment buildings. We jump down here, and this is when I talked a little bit about this earlier. There's a lot of mixed information coming out right now about Bakhmut because of the uptick in kinetic activity here, or significant combat activity. And what we end up seeing is down here, this is in the village of Kurdyumivka, and this is near Toretsk, which is just down here to the south. Talking about this kind of axis of advance in general, we know that there's been significant fighting happening here, and the war of attrition is down here as well. The same general situation as Bakhmut, it's just been a little bit more stable until very recently. There are conflicting reports that Ukraine has repelled a counterattack here, but there's also reports that Russian forces, specifically the Wagner group, actually encircled the Ukrainian forces in this village, requested that they surrender, which was refused, and then the Ukrainian forces fought out of that encirclement and were able to link up with friendly forces again. It is unclear exactly what has happened. What we do know is a significant amount of activity is happening here, and it is very kinetic, and we do have some footage coming out. And this video is muted, so I apologize, guys. But we do know that the fighting here has been very brutal. We see, obviously, the amount of destruction ongoing here. You see destroyed Russian tanks, of course. Gonna mute that. But yeah, these guys have been holding the line here. But once again, we've heard conflicting reports that they are at this, or that they have been encircled, or that they were able to repel it. But we do know that the situation is very difficult in this section of the line, and that Ukrainian forces are having a difficult time against the Russian troops just because of the sheer amount of them. We can see a very close call here. This is a team with a pickup nearly getting hit by a mortar. Luckily, everyone got away safe. This is what Ukrainians would consider a second birthday. You can see this team getting in here. Let me guess, 60mm mortar. Yep, there's the... Nope, not a 60mm mortar. Yeah, that's generally speaking, that's a bad time. Are you going to seriously leave? Yep. Would not have left the mortar. That seems like a really bad to go call from an outsider's perspective, but I'm not also going to blame them, because that is definitely... not willing to stick around. They got you zeroed. But here's an interesting bit. Now, we talk about propaganda from the Russian side versus reality of the war. I've heard a lot of interesting things coming out regarding casualty figures and stuff. But once again, I steer away from talking about physical military casualties, not just for operational security purposes or morale purposes, but because the reality is that we truly don't know. And while there are estimates, I don't comment on Russian military casualties outside of the immediate situation, and I don't talk about the duration of the war or anything like that. It's just what we see and what we get. But there is a big difference. So this is the exact same. This is very lucky that we have this. And so this is footage from Russian media. I believe it's actually from the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, that they are posting of a Lancet drone striking a Ukrainian artillery piece and saying it was destroyed and all of that stuff, trying to show, yes, we're winning. And our troops are fighting valiantly and destroying the Ukrainians. And then we actually have Ukrainians, from their point of view, of their artillery piece after it was hit, and the reality of the damage it actually did. So we get a very clear picture of a difference between what is being portrayed specifically to the Russian people and people who back the Russian Federation, whether they be useful idiots or actual propagandists or whatever. Or oblivious to anything else, or whether we're talking about, the reality of the ground of what is actually happening and how these situations are playing out. And it's a very good emphasis on the difference between the two. So take a look here. I think it's very interesting. I think it's very important to watch, and it is translated, which is amazing. So this first part comes from the Russian Federation. This is the Lancet drone. As they're targeting this D-30 artillery gun.
52-мм буксируемая гаубица Д-20.
Що це по вам прилетіло? По вашій робочій машині?
Безпілотник камікадзе, швидше за все ланцет. Як бачимо, 4 крила від нього.
Уламки.
Да, що там? Уламки валяються.
4, 5. Так як ви говорили. Що заложують вони у цей пристрій, таку арматуру, куски, яка розлітається і робить свою справу.
Це щоб осколки були, так?
Це, да, замість осколка. Це типу як шрапнель по-своєму. Ось такі арматура, 14 діаметр.
Всі живі, все добре?
Да, слава Богу, всі живі і здорові, цілі.
Гаубиця, да, поміняти колесо і вона буде працювати. В принципі, шкоди вони великої не наробили.
Just change the wheel, it'll work. That is the reality of a Lancet drone hitting that. So you got to see the actual Lancet drone strike, thanks to the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, when it actually strikes the target. See here. And that big explosion it causes, and yep, it busts. Yep, you blew our tire, guys. Damn. Yeah, that's the difference between propaganda and reality. Is things happen in mysterious ways in a war. Okay, it's just there's things you can't explain. Some of it, and a lot of it, boils down to just either having great luck or having really bad luck. And that's usually the two types. There's not really a great in between. And when it comes to And so it really is a toss-up between who gets hit, who doesn't, how bad the damage is. It could be you could take a direct hit, nothing happens, and you could take a direct hit and it kills everybody, everybody around you, and you included, or seriously wounds them. Like it's weird. It's unexplainable. There's just a fate. It's just luck. It's just luck at the draw. And so these guys apparently got very lucky, but you can see the difference between what the Russians are portraying. They portray the destruction of this artillery gun. It's out of action. The Russians are winning. But then you go and you have the video footage from the Ukrainians, and they're looking at it. They're like, yeah, they popped our tire. Like they ran over a pothole that was just a little too big or something. Like they popped the tire. So that gun, they literally changed the tire and they just continue on their way. Like nothing happened. No catastrophic destruction at all. So really puts into perspective, what is being portrayed and how they are portraying it on both sides. And we see from the Ukrainians, there is propaganda happening on both sides, and I want to make it very clear, there is an information war ongoing. It is no different than the actual war ongoing, but it is a different sector of the fight. Ukraine and Russia are both, putting out narratives that benefit them or undercutting each other's narratives. But in general, what we see coming from Ukraine and what they're saying aligns pretty much dead on to, what they're saying is aligning with what we're seeing on the ground and the reality coming from all the other sources, the independent ones, people who may or may not should be releasing some of this information. It aligns very well. Whereas for the Russians, they have a very, very drastic different point of view of this that does not reflect the reality of their situation whatsoever. It reflects nothing regarding the reality of what's happening on the ground, how their troops are operating, or their battle, or any battlefield successes, or really anything that is happening inside this country. It is completely falsified narrative, and to a varying degree depending on who you're talking to. But generally speaking, any media is state-run out of Russia, and basically everyone else is a useful idiot. And I've seen them use Ukrainian combat footage for themselves. And I believe we've even aired some of that and said, yeah, look at this. Pretty wild. So it's interesting. Book and 40 says, also hearing Iranian drones have disappeared and must have run out of them. It's questionable. Maybe there's a delay in shipment, but I don't hold my breath on anything. We could talk about how there are very clear and very present signs that the Russians have run out of munitions, but they continue to use cruise missiles in massive quantities against Ukraine on a near daily basis. And we've been saying for months that their stockpiles have to be running low. So when it comes to war, one of the worst things you can do is underestimate somebody. And to say Russia is out of shaheeds would be to underestimate them completely. It would say that the threat is neutralized when the threat very well is probably not. And so I don't believe it is a smart decision to state as such. JP says, I'd be a moron in the rear echelon who catches a straight dumb bullet from 2 miles out. Yeah, that's generally speaking, any luck I have used up. William Young says, I thought I heard they'd taken the nuclear warheads out of ICBMs and just used them in cruise missiles, but perhaps that was only a rumor. No, that is not a rumor. We have photos of them doing that. We have seen photos of them using the training head on their ICBMs. According to UkraineWire.org, thank you to JL. According to UkraineWire.org, according to Kyiv, Iran has stopped supplying weapons to Russia. I do question that, though. I will question that. I know it's being said, but I do question it, just because there is a lot of... Iran's never been exactly truthful either, and Iran and Russia are very close allies, or have become relatively close allies, and Russia has significantly assisted Iran in a lot of ways. So, but yes, William, that as far as the evidence goes for the usage of ICBMs being used as cruise missiles, we are seeing evidence that does support that coming from several of the strikes that have occurred in Ukraine thus far, and can so far with some kind of confidence confirm that that is happening based off of the photo evidence that has been presented so far of some of the remnants of these munitions. We come over here to Kharkovo, depending on who you're talking to, where 2 people were killed and 1 were wounded in Russian shelling. Russian shelling on the 27th left 2 people dead and another injured after rockets fell upon residential areas and even a playground in Kharkovo here in the Donetsk Oblast. You can see, obviously, the strike landed right next to this child's playground, right next to the swing and the slide. Maybe you can see the damage to the apartment buildings behind it. Up here and this covers for the majority of the Donbass, we see where, even though there's been a significant increase in active fighting, volunteers from charities and even the Ukrainian police, the White Angels, are continuing to attempt to evacuate civilians in the Donbass, many being elderly who are unable to evacuate themselves and therefore have had to stay in these oftentimes embattled cities such as Bakhmut. But we take a look here. This really covers the entirety of the Donbass, and very often they are doing it while under shell fire. But this is translated, and we do get to see this footage coming out. Take a look.
Здравствуйте. Бабуля, как вас зовут? Галька. Галя. Галюня, пойдем. Галя. Давайте. Потом в машину. Давайте. Сідайте. Вперед. Дай вам Бог. Давайте. Поїхали, гради. Давайте. Тут всі поля накрили. Ярик, давай, газ в пол. Бабушка, ви в порядку? Вилазим. Забили на машину, пересідай. Я відкрию. Заходите, бабуля. Бабуля, у вас добре, нормально?
Да, сейчас я расскажу, як я...
Сейчас на адреналинчику добіжите і...
Вперед!
Давай. Боже, поможи. Бабуля, давайте. Лягай. Бабуль, давайте. Понимаю, больно, сейчас добежим, все просмотрим. Бабуля, вперед! Сука! Вперед! Вперед! Давайте. Поможи, під другу руку понесли. Я вижу стоп, но думаю, он успеет. А потом я вижу сиденье перед собой. А потом вижу, бабка летит. Вас мы точно не забудем. Да. Галина. Галька. Це що, бабусь?
Це молитва і оберіг.
Дякую.
Та все в повному бойовому, дружище. Назло все.
Ярик.
От, молодець.
That said they lost control of the car from what I read. I mean, it definitely it definitely happens. you have to understand, most of these roads are definitely like completely screwed, and the Rasputita mud makes it almost impossible to get traction, as we've seen in several videos. We showed several videos of just how difficult driving on most of these roads are, because these would not be considered hardball. We call roads different, different types. This would be considered a lot of the roads in these regions of Ukraine are considered unimproved roads. They're dirt roads, and as a result, when this Rasputita mud hits in, it affects them quite significantly. It makes it very difficult. This is one of the reasons why it restrains forces to maneuver restrains forces maneuvering when they're talking about combat troops. But it also restricts them to hardball pavement, really funnels them and bottlenecks them, and makes their movements rather predictable and therefore easy to target and zero. But for people that are trying to rescue them, I mean, they're trying to get out of there because they're usually under fire when they're trying to rescue and evacuate these people under shelling. And they're trying to get traction in this really slippery mud and ice and water. And yeah, they probably did lose control. I mean, it's incredibly difficult to drive on it under good circumstances, let alone under shelling. So I don't fault them for losing control of the vehicle whatsoever. I don't think anyone could. And I mean, it happens. I mean, but the important thing is that everyone made it out safe, and that they were doing it in as professional of a manner as possible given the situation, I think. There has to be some... We're not there. We're not the ones that have to make those decisions or doing the things that they're doing. So we have to trust that they are, we can observe and we can critique after the fact, but the reality is that we're not there. Just like I said for the guys who left the mortars behind, I'm not there. I would never leave the mortar behind. I don't care how close the shelling is. You don't leave your weapon systems behind. This is the thing that saves your life and allows you to do the job you do. But I'm not the one that's there to make that call, and I'm not about to critique, and I can't critique them after the fact, even if I don't disagree with something, or even if I disagree with something. So, and speaking of the weather that would have made them lose control of the car, I think is probably the situation on top of this adrenaline period. Weather is making it very difficult for offensive operations. We see this is the thick Rasputita mud that's freezing over here. And you can see this is just the general environment of Ukraine right now. I mean, it is just mud and water and rain and sleet and ice and snow, and it is a miserable mess. But you can see these guys, they're trying to ford through this. I don't even know what at this point. Probably it was a field, and now they're trying to get this truck unstuck. You want to talk this is straight up just not having a good time. This is what you call this is bad to go. But these are the conditions. These are the conditions of Ukraine. We can see just how difficult it is in the trenches once again. This is some footage coming from the trenches. Thanks to, of course, TikTok. Which I do not believe I can full screen this properly, so I apologize. Yep, there we go. Yeah. Fantastic. Just doing anything they can to somewhat keep warm and keep their feet dry. He's using a blowtorch on his feet. Yeah. That is the reality of being on the trenches. So this is a hip pocket class on making a 2-man carry for someone who is unconscious or immobile as a casualty. A hip pocket class is a class that you give on the spot. It is something that you have knowledge on, and you turn around and you decide, because when you're not fighting, you're training to get better, to learn new skills that you could then employ in action when need be. And giving these hip pocket classes is stuff we would give all the time. I would go, and I still have some stuff from it, where I would go and I'd grab a whiteboard and some expo markers, and I'd say, okay, here is this, this is your range, or these are your units, these are your units, this is the terrain, this is the situation, this is your mission. How would you carry this out? Trying to build some of those small unit leadership skills that I learned when I was a junior guy and I was receiving these hip pocket classes. I'd turn around and I would do those, and I would make when we were having issues, I made stuff regarding Turkish armor and Syrian armor and Iranian armor and equipment, Iraqi armor and equipment, and I would give hip pocket armor ID classes and all sorts of stuff. Just stuff pretty much on the spot, or almost on the spot, very little preparation. And that's what he's giving here, is a hip pocket class on making a 2-man carry for an immobile casualty. And it's very important. Now, it's in Ukrainian, but you can get the general idea. You don't have to speak it because he demonstrates it. So we'll just take a look here.
Вы его не можете взять просто и поднять. Подошли, подняли голову, поставили до свою ногу. Настолько глубоко, насколько сможете. Да, ты расслабься ты. Дальше. Я приподнимаю человека за плечи, то есть за лопатки. Вот приподнял настолько, насколько смогу. Я насколько смогу, просовываю туда свою ногу. Приподнял, 5. Я не поднимал настолько, расслабься. Вот. Приподняли, ногу подсунули. Приподняли, ногу подсунули. Приподняли, ногу подсунули. Таким образом, вы по чуть-чуть туда продвигаетесь. И он вам по чуть-чуть ложится на ногу. Подняли, ножку подсунули. Подняли, ножку подсунули. И там вот в какой-то момент, ты опять поднимаешься сам. В какой-то момент вы уже сможете поднимать его своей ногой. Да. По чуть-чуть. И вот я уже, считайте, поднимаю сам ногой. Посадили. Дальше. Руки. Под мышки. И берем человека за предплечье. За любое. То есть, вот здесь вот. Там, где мы носим часы. Поэтому и называется «Отдай часы». Мышки взяли. Видим?
Да.
Видим? В таком положении человека можно тащить. Или поднять и нести. Значит, если мы поднимаем, тут нужно не сорвать спину. Понимаем, тяжелый вес, если будем поднимать, можем спинку сорвать. Чтобы такого не было, нужно поднимать правильно. То есть становая тяга. Для этого становимся ближе, то есть ножки туда. Так, чтобы его задница была у вас между ног. Дальше садимся. Так, чтобы у вас спина была вертикальная. То есть вы поднимаете не вот так вот, а с ровненькой вертикальной спиной. Опять-таки, частая ошибка. Человек сначала сел, потом встал в эту позицию и начинает. Так, как вы сели, так ровненько и встали. И понесли. Если нас двое, закинул ногу на ногу, берешь за нижнюю штанину либо за пятку, идем ногами вперед, готов?
А что ногами вперед?
Когда он идет, мы идем оба лицом вперед. У него одна рука свободна, если нужно, можно отстреливаться, в разные что-то передавать и так далее. Увидели?
Да.
So entirely in Ukrainian, but you can get the gist of what he's talking about here. But it's so the first thing he's demonstrating is kind of how to get someone up and into the position to buddy drag them, and that's when he reaches under the arm, grabs the guy's forearm, and he's dragging him back. That's called a buddy drag. Okay, if they have a flak jacket. If they have their vest on, you can also grab them by their vest. If they have plate carriers in, you can grab them by their vest and drag them too. That's something else you can do, as long as they're wearing it properly. That's why vests now, a lot of them have handles in the back. You can grab someone by the back of their vest and you can drag them out by the handle. Now I'm sure that they are aware of this. There's another type of, and I think this is the most important type of evac you can do on foot, that I think is probably the most important to teach. And that is the fireman's carry. If you've ever seen someone fireman's carry somebody, actually I'll look it up here. Yeah, here we go. So that is the fireman's carry. And so this is how you would carry somebody. You can do this by yourself. Generally speaking, carrying somebody sucks. There's no two ways around it. People are heavy. People in a combat load are really heavy. And it was something, my seniors, we actually had someone, he was well over 200 pounds. I mean, he was a big guy, normally, and they had him put on combat gear, and then little 168 pound me got to pick him up as dead weight. He wouldn't help at all. Got to pick him up in full gear, dead weight, and put him on your back, and you had to fireman's carry him like 200 meters, like this. Because this is a one-man carry. It only puts one guy out of the fight, and generally speaking, the way that they're carrying him like that gets very tiring. It's very hard. It takes a lot of arm strength to do that. This, he's resting on your shoulders. It's skeletal. You're carrying a pack, and generally speaking, you can sustain that weight much easier. It may be difficult. It will screw your knees up, but generally speaking, you can now, instead of having two guys carrying up one guy and having two guns out of the fight, now you have one, or having three guns out of the fight, really. You have two guns out of the fight, and the other guy can assist in providing security or trade off with you, which is something you can do. Even though it can be very tricky and difficult, you can actually trade off on a fireman's carry. So that's my recommendation personally. I'd never recommend doing two-man carries if ever possible. Dale says, what's the usual weight of soldiers' equipment on the battleground, Paul? That is very mission dependent. Generally speaking, for me. So for myself, so at the time I weighed 168 pounds. Generally, anywhere from 160 to 180, depending on how much muscle mass I was putting on and how much I was eating. But you can do, so all in all, your combat load, just your rifle, your helmet, your vest, and your magazines fully loaded, comes out to about 60 pounds. All in all, additional to your weight. So that puts me at about, I'm 160, it puts me about 220. And then on top of that, my unit usually didn't carry full packs like these guys are carrying. We usually, because we were in vehicles, we were a mounted platoon. I was in Humvees and in MRAPs and MATVs most of the time. So because they have to fit in the vehicles, we put them, we used the assault pack or a day pack. It would look like a backpack to you. And I would cram a lot of stuff in that because I was carrying, I was carrying hygiene gear. I was carrying extra changes of socks. I was carrying additional water, additional magazines, 500 feet of 550 paracord, Marking materials, I was carrying basically anything. MREs, usually enough to last several days. So I was carrying quite a significant amount of stuff. I would say probably in general, you can expect probably an additional 80 to 85 pounds in total. So that is in general. So you're talking about, I already weighed 168 and I'm carrying an additional 80 to 85 pounds with my day pack, not including my assault pack. My assault pack could be up there. The most I have ever carried was 217 pounds of gear, because I was also bringing ammunition and a bag for the 240. I was bringing 50 cal ammo and everything else. It weighed more than I did, and it took two guys on either side of me to load the pack on top of me so I could strap it in and hold it in place while I strapped it in. They had two guys on either side, picked up the pack, threw it on my back, and then I threw the A bag on top of that and started carrying and going. So it's extensively heavy. It is unbelievably heavy. Which means that the other guy could be carrying this dude's pack while you carry the dude. You know, that's one of the perks of the fireman's carry. He could load on that pack. So it's very heavy. The equipment is very heavy. It adds up. The joke is everything in the Marine Corps is labeled lightweight. Lightweight combat helmet, lightweight whatever, lightweight pack. And they give you 200 pounds worth of lightweight shit that you have to carry around with you. So that's generally speaking the ongoing joke, but it's very true. It is very heavy. The javelin, that does not include the javelin. The javelin adds an additional 30 pounds, or the javelin missile brings about an additional 35 pounds, and then the clue, the launch it, brings about another 17. So you're talking about my combat load, my pack, the javelin. If I'm taking a javelin missile, I'm taking my main pack, with all of my sustainment pouches, because I can strap the javelin missile underneath the pack. I don't have to rest it on top. I can strap it into the pack, and then I can take the clue in its carrying case, and I can clip it into the pack itself. So you're talking about probably 80, 90 pounds, plus the javelin brings it up to, 110, plus the clue, 120. If you're carrying both, usually your gunner will carry, you have multiple guys in the team, so normally the gunner will carry the clue, and then the team lead, and then the ammo man or the security man will carry additional javelin missiles. But you could technically carry all three, and you can also carry the tow missiles, which weigh significantly more. Tow missiles weigh about 70 pounds in general. It's miserable, but you train to do it. I mean, but yes, equipment is very, very heavy, very heavy, unbelievably heavy. It sucks. I have no. To give you an idea, I have degeneration in my lumbar, and I have degeneration in both of my knees, and basically have no cartilage in my meniscus because of hiking equipment, and I was a mounted unit. Delta Aviation says, did you have Mad Max vehicles while using the Javelin? No, I mean, the soft guys had technicals. Did use the technical Hiluxes, and then the UTVs, the all-terrain vehicles. Generally speaking, those were a newer thing. That was actually a doctrine that we were working on, because CAT, which is Combined Anti-Armor Team, what I did, we were developing a couple of new doctrines. I tested the Cat Light, Cat Heavy. Cat Heavy is the heavy armored vehicles we were doing at the time, and then Cat Light is basically taking the Hunter Killer doctrine and then using those UTVs, those little basically like Polaris, those little Polaris vehicles, and running around with javelins instead of tow missiles. And then that was Cat Light. But then you also do, there's another one that we were testing where it was you attaching a javelin team to a sniper section, and going out with them, because it provides significantly increased capability optically, and then you could also engage armor systems and provide additional firepower and security element to a sniper team and stay in their hide with them, which is really cool. That was something that I actually tested on my second deployment and got to help spearhead as the guy in charge of the javelin team going out with the snipers. So it was pretty cool. But yes, we do kind of have that, but not really. Speaking of while you have to carry all this heavy shit and it's raining and it's cold and it's miserable out and you're constantly under fire, you get kind of demoralized. Not gonna lie, it pretty much sucks the life out of you. That's putting it mildly. Nobody likes to be cold, wet, and miserable, but you have to keep your head held high in some way, shape, or form. And we do see that coming from Ukrainian troops here as they perform what they are now calling the Ukrainian Olympics. So these guys, they're firing. These are I believe these are the 105 millimeter artillery guns. They're rating the performance. How good was the team? I'll give it a 4. Always overly harsh on each other, of course, but it's all in good fun. But yes, that is the Ukrainian Olympics right now. Is they're rating each other firing artillery guns. Apologize, by the way, if you're hearing some like smacking around in the background. My cat has decided that she would like to play with her activity board and get some treats. Jump up here and into Dnipro, where we get on less happy topics. We get back really to the war here, which is the fact that Russian shelling ended up leveling a neighborhood. So Russian shelling ended up hitting Dnipro, and it leveled the neighborhood. It turned it just crumbled houses. It shattered windows, and it twisted cars like they were tin cans. It's insane to look at. So this is a suburb of Dnipro, an entire residential neighborhood that was just obliterated by Russian missile strikes. And I do mean completely obliterated. Once again, that's not a military target. And Zaporizhia received a lot of the same thing. So Zaporizhia ended up receiving some more additional missile strikes on the suburbs. Hit some industrial enterprises, but it also ended up shelling and hitting civilian residences as well. We come down here into the Kherson region, where we get some very interesting insight. So all of these different locations on the map that you're seeing right here, you may have remembered whenever we're talking about the building of defensive lines. This is generally the symbol we use, and the reason and what we're seeing here is we actually have 4 different points that have been identified with geolocation to identify them as to exactly where they're at. These are Russian defensive positions that were identified thanks to Maxart satellite, and we can see here this is the first one. This is near Velika Blavoshenka, and we do have the geolocation added here for you guys to take a look at it. So to give you an idea, this is what it looks like now, or this is what it looked like prior. This is the location of this defensive position, and this is coming from Maxar satellite feed. This is what it looks like now. We can see them establishing those fighting positions. You can see them. There's the checkpoint there along the road. You can see this is a communications trench that they have coming back. You can see the trench lines that they have dug. They also have ditches and berms in front of them. Prevent fire. You can see they're coming back. These are ammo storage. This would be ammo storage. These would be communications trenches coming back and ammo storage, as well as dugouts for personnel. You see this entire defensive line here, but you can see as well those dragon's teeth. These are the dragon's teeth that are out in front. That we've seen these used very heavily along the Wagner line to the north in Svatovo or Svatove up in Luhansk. And then if you look out here in front of it, you see another really big ditch, and it makes it really easy to just kind of drive around their defensive position. But so what this is considered is a defense in depth. There's multiple levels to the defense. And what you see is this right here, this is a tank ditch. This is a big ditch. That means it makes it very difficult. Tanks can't really cross over it, which is the whole point of tanks, was to cross. They originally invented to cross over, trench lines and stuff, and then just kind of roll over them. Well, tank ditches were now built. These are really wide trenches that a tank will end up sinking into, and it can't get back up the other side. It bogs them down. So that's the first layer of defense against armored push against it. Then they have the dragon's teeth, and then they have the defensive layer itself. And you can assume that in this position, not only do you have rifle positions, but you're also going to have machine gun positions, probably some L shapes. We can probably safely assume that these positions here are probably automatic weapons emplacements. These are larger trenches, allow for a wide area sector of fire. And then also we can see that they would be mutually supporting each other from here. But it would have interlocking fields of fire, as well as rifle trenches and ditches here with secondary emplacements along these trench lines, which is what you want. But you're also going to probably looking at a couple of anti-armor emplacements there as well, probably more often than not RPG-7s, maybe an ATGM. But that is the line over by Velkia Blahoveshchenka. To the south of that, this is near the village of Stepne, which is here in the Kherson Oblast as well. And we take a look here. This is where this defensive line is located. Once again, we do have it geotagged. This is a very interesting defensive line as well, and it's very interesting how they have built this. It's not what you would expect. This is not proper trench building, or proper trench building from the understanding of how you should do this. But you can see they have built, these are supplementary batteries. These could be used either as, we can't see vehicles in them, but these ditches in the center can either be used for, you could put artillery. They may be big enough to be putting self-propelled guns into them to make them artillery capable, basically fighting positions for vehicles, tanks, artillery, or they could be to protect logistical vehicles. We've seen them back logistical vehicles into these trenches. Around it, you have a defensive line, and this really gives you a good example of how trenches are built in singular form. They're not one straight line, but they're zigzags. So that way, one person can't jump down into the trench and kill everyone in the entire trench line. Likewise, explosions and bullets like to travel along walls. It's weird that it works like that, but it does. That's why they tell you don't get too close to a wall. Get along the wall, but don't get too close to it, because bullets, for whatever reason, like to travel down them. So explosion shrapnel won't go down the entire, or eventually runs into a barrier on either side, and it doesn't continue down the rest of the trench. And if one section of trench gets destroyed, it doesn't mean that every section of trench is therefore now also destroyed and damaged. It compartmentalizes it. That is, in a single, when you're looking at trenches individually, very good. What makes this a poor defensive line is that you see these trenches, but there's only one of them. you don't see, usually trenches are built in a series. You have, so you have the front line trenches, and then you have, which would be like these ones here. From there, you have what's called communications trenches that work their way back, also zigzagging, and that has communication lines. That's how you get supplies up. That's how reinforcements and guys get rotated on and off the line. And then in the rear, you're going to have trench lines that have like the dugouts for troops, and that have supply areas and ammo caches and everything else that they need. This is a cylindrical defensive position using defensive lines, trench lines, but they only have a single set of trench lines, meaning that there is no supplementary position for them to return to, or a secondary position for them to return to. They are completely exposed into the open, and should one part of this be breached, the entirety of this is breached, and it would allow for Ukrainian troops to enter and clear it. They also, once again, you can see here, they have that tank ditch, and it appears to be berms on either side around here as well, kind of in a horseshoe shape, and you can see where they're mapping out building it, and you can see you can see where they're driving here along where they plan on building this thing. So that's near Stepney. Down here, this is near Novotroitsky. Once again, another defensive position. This is a little bit better. This is more or less what you would expect out of a defensive trench network. Now, it's a little bit more difficult to see some of this because it's very darkened by the cloud coverage. I don't know what to tell you there, but there's some nice, so you see a nice tank ditch followed by a berm. It makes it exceptionally difficult to climb over. This is how we normally build the outside of our fobs. And then you see that defensive network. Once again, you can see the emplacements here. And then this here is where you're seeing what I was talking about just a moment ago. You see there's a front line trench right behind the tank berm, and you see the front line trenches. You have the tank ditch, you have the berm, then you have the dragon's teeth, then you have front line trenches, and now you can see here the communication trenches that run all the way back, probably 100 or a couple hundred meters. They run back. These are communications trenches. They zigzag back from the front lines, and they go back here. And you can see where they have these emplacements for, where they have the dugouts and the ammunition storage, and they have the communication centers, and they have all of this stuff. This is how you would expect a trench line to be properly built. And if you look at photos from World War I battlefields taken with very early aerial photography, you see this design pattern in those very well established World War I trenches. So this is what you would expect. You can see very clearly the defense in depth. You can see, once again, the tank ditch, the berm, the dragon's teeth, the front line. Then the front line is connect via communication trench that runs back to the main supply trench. That runs all the way here. You can see the offshoots where they have the ammunition, the sleeping quarters, the dugouts, the mess would be back there. And probably the mess is actually pulled all the way back here into this rear echelon area. So this is where these guys would get out of their trenches and they would pull supplies from and what have you. But that is what you expect it to look like. This is almost a textbook example of building static defensive lines as opposed to the others. And then we come over here up a little bit to the north. This is... And you can see where here in these areas, they are taking their time to build this defensive line. They're taking their time to building these defensive positions. There actually is a thought process to these. Here, it's a little bit less so. This looks much like the front line temporary static defenses and earthworks that we have seen built in other locations throughout the war, where the troops are relatively under fire or trying to do it in a very hasty manner to give themselves something, but not necessarily what they should be doing or should be planning for. We see that here. This is over by Novokamenka, And you can kind of see the outline of it here, but they actually they outline it, and you can see the newest section here, and you can see it much more clearly on this footage here. And we're going to wait till it cuts. And there you go. You can see it very clearly there. That static defensive line that cuts through. And once again, it looks like this is a tank ditch that they have cut through the field here. And then rounding about the outskirts of the city and into the rest of the field, you can see where they have a single defensive line. But it is essentially a straight shot. It is a straight line all the way down. That's kind of what we're seeing here. And that is not how you want to build a trench. But it appears to be what they are doing here. It looks like there's a possibility, if you look down here in the bottom, it looks like there's a possibility that they could be also building a defensive line here. But it's kind of hard to tell from the footage. But that is geolocated. You can go on there and you can pull the grids for these things. We have provided them as they have been provided to us. These are geolocated positions. These are direct satellite imagery, the latest Maxar satellite imagery footage of the defensive positions being built by the Russian Federation on the eastern side of the Dnipro River. Jump up here over into the western side in the Ukrainian-controlled sector of Kherson. We're seeing once again Russian shelling is pounding the city of Kherson. We continue to see that, even though we've seen it be pounded for weeks now. And we're seeing that while there have been no casualties officially reported yet, we do know so far there is currently shelling that has been ongoing in the city of Kherson tonight. And we can identify at least one apartment building which has been struck by the shelling. We do not have any information regarding casualties, however. But here's the footage coming out of Kherson tonight. Those are not military targets. And neither were these people. These are homeowners' bodies which have been found by Ukrainian authorities. As we are well aware, the Russians usually commit atrocities everywhere that they go. And the Kherson region was definitely not immune to that. As we see here, the bodies of two Ukrainian homeowners in the Kherson Oblast, a 49-year-old male who was killed after Russian forces put a machine gun in his mouth and then pulled the trigger, and a 78-year-old female who was shot in the back of the head and was thrown into a ditch alongside her cane. The Russian forces then moved into the home and lived there for the duration of the occupation. It's being reported by the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. 49-year-old Serhiy Novosad was killed with a shot from a machine gun with the barrel put in his mouth. And a 78-year-old Lyubov Novosad who was shot in the head and thrown in a ditch along with her canes. Jump over here and into the Odessa region. We see that the grain corridor update coming from the Ministry of Infrastructure of Ukraine. On November 29th, 3 more ships left Ukrainian ports Odessa, Chernomorsk, and Privdeni through the grain corridor. 61,000 tons of Ukrainian agricultural products are on board, heading to countries of Europe and Asia. Currently, 23 ships remain in the ports of Odessa. 856,000 tons of Ukrainian agricultural products are loaded onto them. Since August 1st, 500 ships have left the ports of Odessa, and they are exported to about 12.27 million tons of Ukrainian food to countries of Asia, Europe, and Africa. And that's coming from the Ministry of Infrastructure of Ukraine. Finally, monuments to Catherine II and Suvorov will be dismantled. Odessa's council has voted today to remove the city's giant statue of Russian Empress Catherine the Great, reviewed by many as the city's founder, and move it to the park dedicated to the Soviet past. A bust of the famous Russian writer Pushkin was also removed. So that is the monument of Catherine the Great. And that is the bust of Pushkin, who is removed. So, taking a look back here, see questions here. JL asked a question. Paul, what do you think about the opinion of that those better trained Russian soldiers are just going to sit in settlements close to the front and defend there through the winter, while Milics will be thrown into the meat grinder? I've heard that from a combat paramedic that was recently interviewed. He suspects that's what Russians are going to do. Probably not. The reason I say that is probably not going to be what's happening is because they can't afford it. The reality is that the Russians really don't have any specially trained group, effectively trained army forces anymore. They took a significant amount of time to train even the volunteer battalions. They made it into a third corps that they entered Ukraine, and in 72 hours they were rendered completely combat ineffective. So it is absolutely, yeah. So the Russians mobilize because they have extremely significant manpower issues. They couldn't afford the casualty rates that they were taking amongst their actually trained army, and now you're looking at them mobilizing troops. Those troops are coming in to fill the gaps in their line, so that way the Ukrainians have a harder time of exploiting gaps in the line, which is what rolled their flank in the Kherson region. It's what allowed for the Kharkiv region to fall so quickly, is gaps in the line allowed for them to outmaneuver basically Russian troops in their defensive positions. And those manpower issues, those high casualty rates, and therefore the manpower issues that they're suffering as a result of them, means that they can't afford to let any troops sit in a nice comfy position, because that means that there is a gap in their line somewhere else. And tactically speaking, you don't want that, because that almost ensures the destruction of your force, and it means that your flanks aren't secure. So the Russians don't have the troops to let anyone really hang back. We don't even see them really rotating troops off of the front line. We see them pushing troops until they're completely destroyed as a unit in their entirety. They maintain them on the front lines until they have been wiped out and no longer exist as a unit. And we've seen that with multiple armored corps. We've seen them with very historically for Russia, we've seen historically significant tank corps and tank divisions that have been obliterated in this war, that fought very valiantly during World War II and have a very sturdy history during World War II, of being the leading tank divisions for the Soviets, wiped out. I mean, immediately, just annihilated. The unit doesn't exist anymore. It exists only on paper. So that's, Yeah. So I don't believe that is what will happen, because the Russians just don't have the guys to do that. They just don't have the troops. They don't have the manpower. They don't have... Because if you pull anyone off the line, you're going to stretch your mobilized forces. And the only thing that the Russians... The only advantage that these mobilized troops allow for is quantity over quality. And if you stretch them out, you lose that advantage, which disregards the whole point of doing it in the first place. So, not that I'm saying that, because that's me thinking rational, and the Russians don't think rationally, apparently. But from a military standpoint, it doesn't make sense to do it. Let me put that there. Because I still have to believe in some way, shape, or form. I have to try and rationalize how this works, and then be completely dumbfounded and have a talking point later when, unsurprisingly, the Russians had no logic to any of their actions whatsoever. But what are you going to do? But that allows us... That is actually it for all of Ukraine. That actually ends up wrapping up all of Ukraine, and we can move on into the international news, which still has a lot to do with Ukraine. And we jump over here and we immediately start in Russia, where once again we get to take a nice look at a Russian logistical hub. Now, we've seen a lot of stuff happening. We've seen where Belgorod has been used quite extensively as a logistical hub. It's also a firing point for them. The whole region is just a giant... It's basically a military staging ground for the Russian forces. They used it during the battles in the north. They used it here in the Kharkiv battles, and they've also been using them in the east for the battles in the Donbass. And we finally can see, with some of the latest Maxar satellite footage and some also pictures which have now been located, these are Russian troops. And we can see them here at this rail hub. Furthermore, this is from Belgorod. This is a base which has been put up. This is in specifically Alexeyevka, Belgorod Oblast. You can see the amount of logistical vehicles which are here. You can see these billeting areas, these buildings which are being used for warehouses right now. I believe that you can even begin to see some of these fuel tanks that they probably are pulling fuel from. Very large equipment areas and staging areas. And it's possible that the Russians could be looking to once again use them in the future for offensive operations to try and relieve the pressure on the troops in the east by opening a second front once again, which I do not believe that they are tactically or strategically capable of. But the Russian, once again, that is saying that you use basic logic to come to those conclusions. And I have been completely dumbfounded multiple times in this war by that. So, coming up in Kursk, rivals, quote-unquote, are getting deeper into Russian territory. Locals in Kursk reported 11 explosions last night, and that have led to a partial power outage. Not a very big explosion, but you can hear the shrapnel whizzing off of that. Coming from Telegram accounts and VK accounts regarding this. So reports of arrivals or missiles that are landing inside of Russia are cotton, as they would call them, are getting deeper into territory. We've never heard of Kursk being struck directly before. We've heard of the region being struck, but not Kursk, the city. Belgorod has been struck before, but it's also much, much closer to the actual fighting. And normally we're hearing partisan work from Bryansk. So definitely pushing deeper into Russian territory, though that's to be expected. Kursk is also It's a historically significant area, but it's also a militarily significant area, as you can see here. So this is Kursk International Airport. Or Kursk Airport in general. It's not a military facility, or at least not mostly a military facility. It's supposed to be a civilian one. But you can see here, that's an Su-25M Frogfoot. You can see here, MiG-29s. Located there on the tarmac. You see MiG-29 getting ready for, he's actually taxiing. These guys are apparently taxiing for takeoff. You know, you can see the installation. You can see the Mi-8 sitting there. Military, I mean, it's being used mostly as a military base. Not really being used for a civilian installation. Even though that's its point. But Kursk is significant in its there's a lot of bases for the Russian Federation that are built here. They were built here by the Russians, and specifically more or less by the Soviets, because these put them in a prime position to defend Russia, generally speaking. If the Cold War ever broke out, the Eastern Bloc is a buffer zone, and then this is the defense of Russia right here. But it gets the closest point for Russian troops to cross into the Eastern Bloc of the Soviet Union, or the Western sections of the Soviet Union, and actually move into these bloc countries from Mother Russia. And so we see a significant buildup in this area. So we're probably going to see more of this in the future, but it will be sporadic as it has been elsewhere. Even though we saw Belgorod targeted quite heavily, I'd say for several months, continuously much earlier on in the war. Coming up into Moscow, false motivation does breed real motivation. This is something I've heard quite often in my career in the Marine Corps, and I never thought it worked, but it may here for propaganda purposes, more or less, generating panic to motivate people for the next wave of mobilization. Bomb shelters are being prepared in underground parking lots in Moscow, fully equipped with, you guessed it, wooden benches. Yes. Bomb shelter. There's a lot more goes into a bomb shelter than that, but okay, guys. So this is basically what they're doing is they're spreading fear of an attack on Russia, and so to spur interest in wanting to join the military, because it basically what they're doing is the people in Russia are becoming more and more discontent. We see this as time goes on. It's not as vast or as vocal or as widespread as many people would like it, myself included, but it is there. And the longer this carries on, the worse that's going to get. But one of the things that really helps is if the people are affected, specifically the Muscovites. Because we already know that Russia doesn't give a damn about anybody else but Muscovites. They really don't. The one of the most tragic realizations I have ever had regarding this war, by a huge disproportionate amount, those that live in Siberia, especially Mongolian populations, and those that live in the Caucasus, like Dagestan and Uzbekistan and Chechnya, the ethnically different, essentially non-white Russians, Muscovites, people from Moscow and St. Petersburg, they have huge high conscription rates. I mean, huge. The people that are dying off in Ukraine are the minorities, like racist to a huge degree. Minorities are being conscripted and ethnically cleansing their own people. the insane thing to realize about the war in Russia, and it's absolutely unbelievable that I could come to this conclusion, is that if Russia wins the war in Ukraine, they succeed in committing genocide against the Ukrainian people based off of a national line. If the Russians lose the war in Ukraine, they succeed in ethnically cleansing their own country. That is the reality for Russia. They want to repopulate it with pure white Russians from like Moscow and St. Petersburg. That is who they would rather have than Muslim Chechens in Grozny and from Uzbekistan and from Dagestan and from over by Mongolia and over in the Pacific. No, they would much rather have pure white Russians. They are ethnically cleansing their own people on a racial and cultural basis. If you don't live in Moscow or St. Petersburg, they don't care about you. But what I mean by that and how it fits in here is they're not building these bomb shelters in Dagestan or in Chechnya or in any of these places. They don't care about those places. They're already being conscripted. They're going to go to the war one way or the other. No one gives a damn. Okay? The war already affects them on a personal level. Everyone is affected. Everyone has lost their sons, essentially, to this war if they live in this region, if they live in those regions. And there's nothing that the government is going to do about it. Like, they don't care about that. That was the point for that to happen. But where the protests for what the protests are in Russia, where these come from, you see it from Moscow and you see it from St. Petersburg. These are the educated individuals. These are the people that their families under the Soviet Union generally lived much better lifestyles. They were very well in with the party, with the Communist Party during the Soviet Union. Generally speaking, they're much better educated, much better jobs. These are the individuals that are going to school, that are going to college, that are holding up high-end jobs, that have traveled abroad, have the money to do things, have the money to invest. These are the more progressive, liberal, generally speaking, for Russia, the more progressive, liberal individuals. And whenever there is distaste in Russia, this is where we see the protests coming from, is from Moscow and especially from St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg is notorious for that in Russia. So what they're doing is they're bringing the war. You know, the war already affects these people. It already affects the people in the border region, but we don't care about them because there's not a lot of them. The war already affects the people in Chechnya and Dagestan. We don't care about them because they're not ethnically white Russians. They're not Muscovites. No, we care about the people here who are going to be the ones to protest if they call for another mobilization. They're going to be the ones that will be up in arms against the government. They're the ones that would be dissatisfied with the government. They're the ones that actually have to Putin have a threat to his power and reign should they uprise against him because he continues to do things that are dissatisfying to his people, specifically those that live in Moscow and St. Petersburg and the surrounding regions, Muscovites. So you bring the war to them. You make it a reality. You put the fear of them that something could be happening, that the danger is real for them to the point that they are making bomb shelters in Moscow. And it brings the war, which is happening very far away from them, that isn't really affecting them because they're not the ones being conscripted. They're not the ones losing their sons and husbands and fathers. No. Those are all the poor minorities that are doing that. So the war otherwise hasn't affected really Moscow or St. Petersburg very heavily. Really, it hasn't. So you bring the war to them, you make it real for the population there, make it, even though there's no real danger, it puts that sense of danger into it, and now that's going to galvanize support within his own population of the true danger that Russia faces, and that will back a mobilization of further additional troops, and that will make the transition go much easier than what was already stated. So I hope that kind of gives an interesting overview as to what the point is and why it's happening in this way. But yeah, basically, they're very racist. They always have been very racist. They're very open about it. It's a very different culture there, but that is the reality of how Russian politics and ideology work. Is if you're not from Moscow or St. Petersburg or the surrounding area, you are not a first-class citizen, which is even how they broke up the republics in the Soviet Union. Was first-class republics, second-class republics, third-class republics. They broke them down into class groups. Kid you not. This is, public relations can be very difficult. I have learned that the hard way. I continue to learn that the hard way. But luckily I haven't gone out of my way to threaten anybody on live TV or on YouTube or on the internet, whatever you want to call this. But Zoloviev, who is the lead propagandist, he's on Russian One. He's the crazy old guy that's constantly screaming and wears the one-piece suit. Yeah, so he has this weird talk show thing that he does on Russian One, and he's threatening viewers on there. You know what, Victor? If you are in Russia, we're going to find you. We will find out everything about you. You won't know a moment's peace. Generally speaking, not how you handle public relations. Generally speaking, not how you have relations with people. Usually breaks those down pretty quick. Reagan would have a good laugh about this. Laugh, not laughed. But Reagan would have an amazing laugh at this next point. That would be U.S. President Ronald Reagan, the one who met Gorbachev and said very intently, tear down this wall. This is a rental apartment building in the small town of Surov, which has a very interesting problem. Due to plumbing issues, a 2-meter tall stalagmite made of frozen fecal material grew in the stairway of the building. Residents complained about the smell and that this issue has been around for over a year. An axe was used to get rid of the stalagmite temporarily. Summary: they have a poop spike growing from plumbing issues in their apartment in the stairwell. They use axe to chop it down. Here we go.
Тот год мы уезжали в отпуск. Вы не могли даже выйти. Тут топило все. Вчера бабушка у меня вышла лопатой аж даже вот эту всю воду. Так это не вода, это сака. Ну, сака. Это сака. Все вливала туда. Потому что невозможно проходить.
В общежитии давно жалуются на коммунальные проблемы. Подъезды...
Remember, 25% of Russia, if I'm not mistaken, 25% of Russia doesn't even have plumbing. So, but that brings up a Reagan joke And we actually have that for you here.
And I told this.
So just take a listen. This is Reagan talking about, tells a joke about buying a car and the plumbing in the Soviet Union. Basically, nothing has changed. And we already knew this. We've talked about how nothing essentially has changed. The Soviet Union just changed their name and who is in charge. And that was it. Nothing has changed. And so this definitely still holds true, especially now that Lada is once again government owned.
And I told this one, Bill, you'll have to hear it again. I told it in the car. I didn't tell this one to Gorbachev. You know, there's a 10-year delay in the Soviet Union of delivery of an automobile. And only 1 out of 7 families in the Soviet Union own automobiles. There's a 10-year wait. And you go through quite a process when you're ready to buy, and then you put up the money in advance. And this happened to a fella, and this is their story that they tell, this joke. That this man, he laid down his money, and then the fella that was in charge said to him, okay, come back in 10 years and get your car. And he said, morning or afternoon? And the fellow behind the counter said, well, 10 years from now, what difference does it make? And he said, well, the plumber's coming in the morning.
Oh, how nothing has changed. Cue Back in the USSR by the Beatles. But yes, there you go. That is Russia. Hadikon 63 tell us about Ukraine dead soldiers. There's quite a significant amount, but we don't talk about military casualties for either side here. Just because battlefield reports, generally speaking, aren't accurate. If you go by the battle damage assessments or the BDAs provided by American commanders during the invasion of Iraq, we killed the Iraqi army 7 times over in its entirety. So, no, definitely not a. We don't cover battlefield casualties here, just the direct situations. Jump over here to Germany, where they're finally calling things by their names over in Germany. The German Bundestag, which is the German parliament essentially, has passed a vote today to recognize the Holodomor as a genocide. No votes were given against it, and 2 parties which traditionally support pro-Kremlin narratives, the AfD and the left, abstained. President Zelensky said, quote, Germany recognized the Holodomor of 1932 to 1933 as a genocide. I thank the members of the Bundestag for this historic decision. Truth always wins, end quote. And yes, by definition, by the 1949 definition by the definition of genocide provided by the 1993 Rome Statute and the 1949 Geneva Convention, the Holodomor is a genocide. Up here in the United Kingdom, the UK is providing kilos to Ukraine. The UK's Royal Navy announced that it would be providing the Sea King helicopters, the Ukrainian armed forces, which have already reportedly been trained on how to use them. Coming from the Ministry of Defense of the United Kingdom's personal Twitter here, and also, of course, adding the Royal Navy, who are the ones that are providing the Sea Kings. And there you go. Okay. And so we jump down here. An interesting incident happened out of, this is going down, this is the Ukrainian embassy here in Madrid, where in Spain, where the embassy received an envelope that ended up exploding in the hands of the of the commandant during the inspection there at the embassy. One staff member was injured, but not life-threatening. Rooster Fontaine asks, are those rescue helicopters? Yes, they are. They act similar in a similar fashion to the to like Coast Guard helicopters. The Sikorsky. Oh, geez. It's not the Sikorsky. I don't want to say it's not the CH-53. It's a Sikorsky helicopter. That's all I can think of off the top of my head. But basically, it's the exact same as a Coast Guard helicopter. They're search and rescue. And my understanding is that they are going to the Ukrainian Navy, who will end up be operating. They're actually having a frigate built right now. So that covers Europe, and that allows us to move down here, if my computer wants to cooperate, down and into the Middle East, where we have more developments coming from the situation regarding Turkey and the Kurdish forces and Syrian forces here in the north. This covers both Aleppo and Al-Hasaka provinces. Turkish forces are attacking PKK and Kurdish positions. The Turkish Air Force and the artillery attacked positions of the PKK in the province of Aleppo and Hasaka. Against the background, the SDS leader said the Turkish offensive is expected in Kobani, Tel Rifat, and Manbij. And at the same time, the Kurds hope for the support of the Syrian army in the fight against Turkish troops and their proxies, because they do use militias similar to pro-regime militia forces as well. According to the updated data of the Turkish Ministry of Defense, 480 members of the PKK were killed. However, the Syrian military also suffers losses. Local sources reported that representatives of the Russian armed forces arrived in Komishli to negotiate with the PKK about the upcoming Turkish operation, offering the Kurds to voluntarily move 30 kilometers from the border, but they refused the offer. And the airstrikes that are carried out, generally speaking, are absolutely devastating. I mean, you go to Syria and its entire village is just leveled and gone. The Turkish armed forces have deployed new forces with the necessary resources to Syria, more precisely to the Aleppo area. And you can see those Kirpi MRAPs. You can even see some of them with Crow systems on top. That right there, you can see by the antennas, that appears to be an anti-IED system. We have a similar system as well that we use, but what that does is it jams it basically jams frequencies around the vehicle in a very limited radius, and it makes it impossible for someone to use like a cell phone to remotely detonate an IED once you hit a certain trigger marker, usually like a stack of rocks or a certain piece of trash in the road.
كم واحدة؟ راجمة عليها راجمة.
Reinforcements of the Syrian army, including 20 tanks, arrived in the area of the city of Kobani in the province of Aleppo. Russian helicopters were also seen over this territory. A number of sources reported that the Syrian army and Iranian formations may side with the PKK. On the other hand, among pro-government sources, ideas about dividing the territory controlled by Kurdish formations between Turkey and the official Damascus are very popular. Of course it is. Of course it is. Because they say they keep listing the PKK. The PKK definitely has a position inside of Syria, but the PKK is not the same as the entire Kurdish formations. So you have multiple different groups, and I've noticed this with the sources that we have here, that they are very much they very much have a bias for Turkey. But the SDF are comprised of multiple groups. About 6 total are major groups. There's a lot of minor groups, but there's about 6 total. And the 2 largest groups are Kurdish. They together form the YPK, which is, and then that further breaks down into 2 segments called the YPG and the YPJ. The YPG is, their insignia is yellow with a red star, and they are the guys. Then the green with the red star is the YPJ. Those are female fighters. That is how they are segmented, but they are democratic forces. The YPG, YPJ, and YPK are democratic. The PKK are Marxist communists, and they are also Kurdish. But there are also about 4 Arab groups that fight within the SDF. And they are mixed together. They are not segmented. So there are about a total of about 6 major formations that form the SDF, 4 of which are roughly Arab, and the 2 being the largest 2 segments are Kurdish. Once again, Turkey just hates Kurds. I mean, I don't know what to tell you. But Manbij is a very important location. A very important location. Al-Hasaka in the general, this whole area is a very important location. You also have a huge, this over here, this is Al-Hol. Sometimes you see it with an O, it's spelled with an A-W-L. But that's the city of Al-Hol. Pretty decent size, but it's not huge. That is the Al-Hol camp. This holds tens of thousands of refugees who've already lost everything. They're internally displaced people inside of Syria. The camp is huge. I mean, it's broken up into quadrants. This sector of the camp right here probably holds equal to, if not more people than the entire city of Al-Hol itself. It's huge. These camps are huge. This is just one camp. There are multiple camps like this. Multiple. So these are regions that are relatively safe. The SDF have secured them. And U.S. forces and coalition forces operate with the SDF. So the coalition forces are here as well. They're not separated. They're embedded with the SDF. We were embedded with the SDF. I lived, slept, worked with SDF guys. They were, yeah, like we couldn't go anywhere without their escort. We lived in their installations. I stood post with guys from the SDF. They translated for us. They brought me chai tea. They sold me cigarettes. They brought me the most amazing shawarma you've ever had in your life. God, I love shawarma. Man, is it good. But you're embedded with them, and there's not really a whole lot of distinction between it. So it's also incredibly dangerous for coalition personnel. Down here in Daraa, the Islamic State leader has been killed. The leader of the Islamic State, Abu al-Hassan al-Hashimi al-Qureshi, was killed in was killed recently, the group's spokesman said in an audio released on Wednesday. The U.S. military said he was killed in October by Syrian rebels in the southern province of Daraa. Al-Qurashi is the second ISIS leader killed this year. If you want more information on that, you can go and check out an AP News article or Associated Press News article, which was written on the subject. Over in Iran, protests do continue for their 10th week now. Anti-government protests continue in the city of Zadan in southeastern Iran, despite numerous brutal crackdowns over the past 9 weeks. Not a particularly small crowd of people either. People from Isfahan also took to the streets tonight chanting against the regime, including workers from the metallurgical plant. So we do see that those protests are continuing despite brutal crackdowns. And Qatar, where the World Cup has been ongoing here. This is at Lusail Stadium. The World Cup has been ongoing, and Qatar has been very much keeping from allowing any kind of statements to be made, specifically against the oppression of many of the countries in the World Cup, including Qatar itself, against the LGBTQ plus community, and also against, and also Qatar being very much an Arab country, against their sentiments against Iran, or with Iran. They're not really leaning on Iran to change at all. A man ended up interrupting the World Cup today between Portugal and Uruguay. The World Cup match between Portugal and Uruguay was briefly interrupted by a pitch invader waving a rainbow flag on the field of the Lusail Stadium. The FIFA Global Television feed avoided showing the pitch invader, but the individual could be seen running on the field trailing the flag as they were pursued by security officials. The man has since been identified as Italian Mario Ferri. Photos showed the flag carrier wearing a shirt with the words "Respect for Iranian Women" written on the back and "Save Ukraine" written on the front. And I apologize, this happened on Monday. But yeah, so Qatar has been very much against making any kind of statements while they were there, to include players. And there's been several different photos that come out of individuals who were trying to make very small statements, including people working on the field, players, and everything else, with very small things, very small, minute details that may have been overlooked. Move over here and into Pakistan, where we have a couple of different. Oh, sorry. Jump up to Afghanistan. This is over by Abak, specifically in. So there was an explosion there that occurred in the madrasa in Abak in Afghanistan. According to preliminary data, 16 people were killed, 27 more were injured. The blast took place in a routine afternoon prayer at the Jadiyah Seminary. No group has taken responsibility for the explosion thus far. And now we jump down into Pakistan, where we see out of the north here in Quetta, we see at least 3 people have been killed in a suicide bombing, and more than 20 were injured. The target was a police convoy headed to Balochistan to protect medical workers. The injured police officers were rushed to the hospital. The Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP, which earlier this week officially announced the termination of the truce with the Pakistani authorities, took responsibility for the attack.
मुझसे खले पीछे चलो किधर जा रखे اخواد الله سے بھائی جان روڈ اخواد اور اے بھائی.
You see some more of that destruction here. Down here in Balochistan, 9 BLA militants were killed during a counterterrorism operation by Pakistani forces. Security forces eliminated 9 militants of the Balochistan Liberation Army, the BLA. 3 more were wounded and detained. The operation took place in Kola district, and the military discovered the hideouts of the terrorists and started a shootout with them. According to law enforcement officers, the destroyed separatists were involved in terrorist attacks against civilian and security forces. During interrogation, the detainees admitted they were preparing assassination attempts on engineers working on promising projects in the province. Jump over here and into Shanghai, which is the center of what is a large-scale, massive wave of protests that have erupted across China. Really unprecedented. Chinese leader Xi Jinping on Monday faced an unprecedented amount of dissent after thousands of demonstrators protested in cities across China over the weekend against his zero-COVID strategy, with some daring to openly call for his removal in the streets. Step down, Xi Jinping. Step down, Communist Party. Some protesters yelled among hundreds who gathered in the financial hub of Shanghai, one of the multiple major cities where protests broke out following a deadly fire Thursday at an apartment block in the far western region of Zhejiang. Footage of what appears to be PLA, or People's Liberation Army, vehicles are moving through the city of Zhezhou, presumably to the site of the protests in Shanghai. Something tells me that, much like Tiananmen Square, we may be seeing a very large crackdown. Jumping down here and into Somalia specifically, we have this geolocated to a specific location here in Mogadishu, right here on this part of the street. Man, that is a name that I do not believe I would be able to pronounce at any time in my life. Jidaka is Bartimada Wadada Muhammad, I'm going to say that's Muhammad Zarbi Harbi. Okay, yeah. This street name here over by Villa Somalia, where 12 Ministry of Internal Affairs employees were killed. Al-Shabaab, an Al-Qaeda-linked militant organization, carried out a large-scale terrorist attack in the city of Mogadishu. On the night of November 27th through the 28th, terrorists attacked the complex of buildings of the presidential palace and nearby government facilities. The attack began with the self-explosion of a suicide bomber in a car filled with explosives. After that, the jihadists started a firefight with the guards and the military. The confrontation continues to this day, and terrorists took refuge in a hotel popular with foreigners and are resisting the security forces. President of Somalia was reportedly temporarily evacuated from Mogadishu. It is reported that 12 employees of the special forces and the Ministry of Internal Affairs of the country were killed and 20 more were injured.
سيدان حافظها المقاحية قريها وحنا كيف واقف سويا بابا صورت تعالى كاريس كركنا وقاري وانا صارف
If you hear that whiz that goes past you, probably, just saying, probably should put down the phone and stop recording and maybe seek shelter. That means it's not past, it doesn't mean it's just close. It means that it is nipping by you. It means that you are in the cone of fire. An interesting story has occurred, a very interesting one indeed. A mystery plane ended up bombing the Central African Republic forces as well as the Wagner Group, Russian mercenary organization located that has been assisting the car for some time. The government said that the plane targeted a military base and dropped explosives on the town of Basagoa in the north, but caused only material damage. The Wagnerites have been there for several years, training local militants. BBC Africa reporting this. Also Benham Jas. It is unknown who this plane belongs to. Up here in the Borno region of Nigeria, ISIS militants, Islamic State militants attacked a Nigerian army convoy. The Islamic State released footage of the aftermath of the attack on the convoy of the Nigerian army in Borno State, where an armored car was destroyed, weapons with ammunition, and 2 motorcycles were seized. It is known that the attack results, as a result of the attack, 3 soldiers were killed. Showing off their trophies, of course. And over here in Mali, the Islamic State militants defeated an entire JNIM group. These are 2 terrorist organizations. JNIM is an Al-Qaeda group, while the Islamic State is actually they're not Al-Qaeda. In fact, Al-Qaeda does not get along with the Islamic State at all. Resources of the Islamic State just published photos of the defeat of the entire group of an Al-Qaeda JNIM in Mali. On the footage, you can count more than 84 corpses, including 3 prisoners who, after interrogation, were immediately executed. The JNIM fighters, acting in concert with local Azawads, launched this attack on ISIS-controlled territory, but greatly underestimated the capabilities of the Islamic State. Got some of the photos coming from that, as well as what they captured. So, interesting kind of backstory. So, you have to back up some time to understand the rise of the Islamic State. So, the Islamic State forms out of essentially an Iranian-trained Al-Qaeda upbrought individual after the fall of the Iraqi government, and really it begins in earnest in 2004, but it doesn't start off as the Islamic State. It starts off as a totally different militant group that I cannot remember the name of, but it's led by an individual named al-Zarqawi, who his methods, his means and methods of how he was conducting his insurgency against U.S. occupational forces in Iraq was so horrendous, so brutal, that Al-Qaeda cut links with al-Zarqawi completely. They didn't even Al-Qaeda, being terrorists themselves, thought that his methods were too inhumane and too brutal in Iraq and wanted nothing to do with him. Well, after several different regime changes and several different types of rebranding, that is the group that eventually becomes the Islamic State. And you see them fighting against the Taliban, you see them fighting against Al-Qaeda, you see them fighting against every other group. In fact, resistance groups in downtown Baghdad, different insurgency groups fought each other in Baghdad. In fact, the Battle of Fallujah was against al-Zarqawi's men. He was the one who was in charge of the militants that were fighting in the Second Battle of Fallujah, the very bloody Second Battle of Fallujah that took place, that the Marine Corps still, heavily talks about. Places like the Hell House, which has the very famous photo of Sergeant Major Castle being brought out. So very well-known group, but they have changed names and rebranded over time. But that is who becomes the Islamic State. But they are so brutal. The Islamic State is so brutal and so extreme in their ideology that even other extremist groups that they originally formed from have completely cut ties and are hostile to them. Think of it like a gang war in downtown Detroit or something. It's like that, except the Islamic State is garnered a very powerful force, especially in Africa, and makes them especially dangerous. Jump across the pond over here and into Mexico, where we actually come over here. This is in Irapuato, where 53 bags of human remains have been uncovered. About 53 bags of human remains have been uncovered since late October in a makeshift grave site in the Mexican town of Irapuato. An excavation that started after locals reported seeing a dog walking with a human hand in its mouth. Irapuato in the Guanajuato area, which has the highest homicide rate within any of Mexico's 32 states. The violence is mostly driven by the years-long war between the Jalisco and the Sinaloa cartels. You see the excavation work being done there. Jump up here into Washington, D.C., where the U.S. Senate has passed a bill to protect same-sex and interracial marriage. The Senate passed a landmark legislation on Tuesday that would codify federal protection for marriages of the same sex and interracial couples, with Democrats securing enough votes to overcome the opposition from most Republicans. The Respect for Marriage Act was approved 61 to 36, with support from all Democrats and 12 GOP votes, or Grand Old Party or Republican votes, after a filibuster was defeated and the 3 amendments offered by Republicans who opposed the bill were rejected. The measure now returns to the House for the final vote before it can go to President Joe Biden, who he said he was looking forward to enacting it. For those who don't know what a filibuster is, a filibuster is a very simple premise. It is who blinks first, essentially. A filibuster is what happens when a congressman who may be opposed to this or was willing to make a statement, they will stand up there. The rule of a filibuster is you cannot lean on anything, you cannot sit, you cannot stop talking, you have to keep talking during your time, or you have to keep talking, and they will talk for hours. I mean, not just like 1 or 2 hours like I do with a stream. I mean 6, 7, 8 hours of continually talking while standing in a suit in the middle of the chamber in opposition to the bill, essentially. They just keep talking. And it can be essentially about anything. But it's who blinks first is really what it is. That is what a filibuster is. They just keep talking until everyone is tired and is like, can we please, for the love of God, go home? That is an actual tactic. Coming from Senator Chuck Schumer of New York. He's also the Senate Majority Leader. And also from the President of the United States, Joe Biden's official Twitter. Now, to jump off the politics over here in the United States, we jump over here into California, coming from Palmetto. The Tesla semi-truck traveled 800 kilometers without recharging. According to Tesla CEO Elon Musk, the developers confirmed that the real experiment that the semi-electric truck can travel 800 kilometers on a single charge in real conditions. Tesla promises that the semi can accelerate from 0 to 96 kilometers an hour in 20 seconds, when fully loaded, and maintain the same speed as on the highway, even on steep climbs. Elon Musk also promises that you can charge your battery up to 70% in just 30 minutes. In early October, it was reported that the company was finally manufacturing its semi-electric truck and plans to start shipping it to Pepsi as early as December 1st, 2022. Soft drink company ordered 100 electric vehicles in December of 2017. Tesla has already confirmed that it's going to hold an event dedicated to deliveries of the first Tesla semi on December 1st. Considering I work in the industry that usually transports these things, I would love to have that opportunity to see what my drivers think of them. And you can check it out here at the Tesla Semi. That is what it's going to look like. I am slightly terrified. But that is it for the news tonight as we wrap up the day. So a lot of stuff happening throughout the world. A lot of stuff that's kind of frustrating if you follow any of this stuff, personally, where you're talking about the war in Ukraine, you're talking about what's happening in Iran, or you're talking about reactions from different parts of the world, you're talking about Islamic terrorism, you're talking about all sorts of stuff happening. It's very frustrating in a lot of ways. The brutal repression of peoples in general. Unfortunately, a lot of this stuff leads to conflicts, and it leads to a lot of suffering and a lot of hatred and a lot of just bad things happening to a lot of innocent people that honestly don't deserve any of it and don't have any say in any of it. And unfortunately, that's majority of who is affected by it. So the whole point of this project in the end is to try and raise money and help people throughout the world with issues that they may be facing, whether that's because of climate change or whether that's because of wars or conflicts. Doesn't matter. The whole point is to help people. So we're never doing super chats on this channel. We're never doing any kind of merchandising. We're never doing any of that. 100% of everything we do goes directly to charity. So please be sure to check out the different charities in the description below. Give them a ton of support and show a bunch of love to them. If you can't give a lot to them, give a little. If you can't give anything at all, that's okay too. One of the best things you can do is help us grow our impact. The more people that come here, watch the news, not only the better informed do they become, but the more people will come here that are able to also give back, allow us to be the news that gives back and donate to these charities and help people. So please, if you can, give us a like, give us that subscribe, share us amongst your different communities. You can follow us on social media and share stuff there as well. All of the links are listed down in the description for you if you want to check it out, as well as the link to our website where you can find them out. And with that, I hope that you, your family, and your friends remain safe, and I hope that if not, you find that safety security in the very near future. Please, I hope that you'll be back with us on Friday at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, 9 p.m. Central, for another 48 hours of news and review. In the meantime, my name is Paul from the New News. Thank you for joining us, and have a fantastic night tonight. Bye now.
Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоять до волноваги, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Нам не треба ні конфлікту, ні війни. Та ми готові всіх вас звать до сатани. Тисячі вже полягло, і все більше шлейфуємо. То для них нема нічого, крім труни. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоять до волноваги, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Вызволять пришел, братишка, ну привет. На моей земле тебе один ответ. Нашим людям плечом, даже танки и бачок. Вам не взять нас и за 100 000 лет. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоять до волноваги, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Mr. Putin, on behalf of all our guys, no one's scared of your nuclear device. You can take your top 11, shove it up your wrinkle bum. Oh, we'll come and help you fit it in your skull. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стоять до волноваги, і чудно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волноваги, чутно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волноваги, чутно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Going home, Russian soldiers, going home. Бо ми всіх вас тут змішаємо з багном. І стріля до волноваги, чутно кличе, діти нахуй. Тут працює ЗСУ і ТМО. Ідіть нахуй.